It began in forests that never seemed to end, where the ground swallowed sound, the trees erased distance, and the front line blurred into something far more cruel than a single battle. Rzhev was never meant to be famous. It was not a capital, not a symbol, not a place meant to decide the war in one dramatic moment. And yet, between 1942 and 1943, the land around Rzhev became one of the bloodiest, most punishing killing grounds of the entire Second World War. So destructive that those who survived would later call it the meat grinder, not as metaphor, but as memory. After the failure to take Moscow, the German front bent but did not break. A massive salient formed west of the Soviet capital, a bulge held stubbornly by German forces, threatening renewed offensives and anchoring pressure on the heart of the Soviet Union. Rzhev sat at the center of that danger, a dagger pointed toward Moscow that could not be ignored. The Red Army would try to remove it, again and again and again. What followed was not one battle, but a series of offensives so relentless that they blurred together in time and suffering. Attacks were launched across forests, swamps, frozen rivers, and mud-choked clearings. Progress was measured in meters. Losses were measured in divisions. This was war stripped of illusion. There were no sweeping maneuvers, no decisive breakthroughs, no clean victories. Only repeated assaults into prepared defenses, trenches layered deep, artillery zeroed in advance, machine guns positioned to scythe down movement the moment it began. German forces, experienced and dug in, absorbed blow after blow. Soviet forces, driven by urgency and sacrifice, returned again and again to the same ground, knowing exactly what awaited them. Winter made everything worse. Snow buried the dead where they fell. Weapons froze. Wounded men waited too long for evacuation. Spring brought mud that swallowed tanks whole. Summer brought insects, rot, and exhaustion. The land itself seemed determined to erase anyone who fought upon it. Entire Soviet armies were committed and shattered. Some attacks failed within hours. Others gained ground only to lose it days later. Commanders rotated, units rebuilt, then returned. For the soldiers on the ground, Rzhev became endless. The same woods, the same villages reduced to splinters, the same fields soaked again and again. Victory, when it came, never felt like triumph. It felt like survival. For the German side, holding Rzhev drained strength quietly. Elite formations were locked in place, unable to move elsewhere. Supplies were strained, losses accumulated even without dramatic defeats. The salient remained, but it bled constantly. And then, almost unexpectedly, it ended. In early 1943, German forces withdrew from the Rzhev salient in a controlled retreat. No final encirclement, no grand collapse. Just a quiet pulling back from ground that had consumed too much to justify holding any longer. The battlefield was left behind. What remained was devastation. Hundreds of thousands dead. Entire regions flattened, families erased. Rzhev faded from headlines, overshadowed by Stalingrad and Kursk. But for those who fought there, it never faded at all. It remained as a memory of endless attack, of sacrifice without spectacle, of a battle that asked everything and gave nothing back. The Battle of Rzhev matters because it reveals the true cost of attritional war. Not the moments history celebrates, but the grinding reality history often forgets. It shows how victory can be shaped not only by decisive blows, but by years of pressure, loss, and endurance that never make it into simple narratives. Tonight, we return to those forests, to the mud and snow, to the place where time itself seemed to stall under fire, to Rzhev, where survival became the only measurable success. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening quietly, if these long, careful journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or sit with stories that deserve patience and honesty, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. When you subscribe, you help keep this kind of slow, immersive storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, calm, or simply somewhere steady to rest your thoughts, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the history of the Battle of Rzhev, October 17th, 2007. Rzhev, Russia. Construction workers digging a foundation for a new apartment complex hit something solid 2 meters down. They expected rock. Instead, their excavator pulled up human bones, hundreds of them. By sunset, the worksite had transformed into an impromptu archaeological dig, and the foreman was calling the authorities with trembling hands. The bones weren't old, they were organized, row upon row of skeletons, still wearing rotted fabric that had once been Soviet military uniforms. No identification tags, no records of burial, just bodies, thousands of them, stacked in trenches that stretched beneath what would become someone's living room. The discovery should not have been a surprise. Rzhev sat only 160 kilometers from Moscow, close enough that people in the capital sometimes claimed they could hear the artillery during the war. This was ground that had been fought over for 14 months straight, from January 1942 through March 1943. The entire region had been chewed up by combat so intense that veterans called it the Rzhev meat grinder, Rzhev Saya Miasorubika in Russian. But here was the strange thing. Most Russians under 60 had never heard of the Battle of Rzhev. It didn't appear in their history textbooks. There were no monuments, no Victory Day parades featured Rzhev veterans marching through Red Square. The battle that consumed somewhere between 1.3 million and 2 million Soviet soldiers had been systematically erased from the official history of the Great Patriotic War. Svetlana Gerasimova was among the first historians to understand what had happened. In the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and archives began to open, she spent months in the Russian Ministry of Defense reading rooms, requesting file after file on the Rzhev operations. Most came back stamped, not available, or lost. The ones she did receive had pages missing, casualty figures redacted, entire operational reports reduced to single-paragraph summaries. She began cross-referencing German military records, survivor testimony, and demographic data from the affected regions. The numbers she compiled were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested Soviet casualties at Rzhev exceeded those at Stalingrad, the battle every Russian knew, the battle that filled their movies and textbooks and monuments. And this massacre had happened closer to Moscow than Stalingrad, against the same German army group, under the command of the Soviet Union's most celebrated general, Georgy Zhukov. The suppression had been remarkably effective. During the Soviet period, Victory Day in Moscow saw massive parades celebrating Stalingrad, Kursk, the siege of Leningrad. Veterans of those battles received medals, pensions, public honor. Rzhev, veterans received silence. When they tried to organize reunions or build memorials, local party officials quietly discouraged them. Publishers rejected manuscripts, film studios passed on scripts. The only significant artistic acknowledgement came from poet Alexander Tvardovsky, who had served as a war correspondent at Rzhev. In 1946, he published a poem titled "I Was Killed Near Rzhev." It became quietly famous among veterans, but was never included in official anthologies. The poem's narrator is a dead soldier, speaking from beneath the earth. I was killed near Rzhev, in a nameless bog, in the 5th Company, on the left flank, in a cruel attack. The lines captured something the state wanted buried, the industrial-scale death of men whose sacrifice led to no clear victory. By the 2000s, satellite imagery of the Rzhev area revealed something extraordinary. The landscape still bore the scars. Aerial photographs showed geometric patterns across hundreds of square kilometers. The ghost trenches and shell craters from battles fought 6 decades earlier. The topsoil remained churned, the vegetation different. Environmental studies found the earth still contained fragments of explosives, pieces of equipment, and human remains. Farmers plowing fields routinely uncovered helmets, rifles, unexploded ordnance. In the forests, trees bore shrapnel embedded in their trunks from artillery bombardments in 1942. The battle had literally reshaped the terrain. Yet official Soviet military history devoted more pages to minor skirmishes in peripheral theaters than to this massive operation. The question haunting historians like Gerasimova was simple. Why? Why would Stalin suppress the memory of a battle this enormous? Several theories emerged. Perhaps the casualty ratio was too embarrassing. Soviet forces had suffered losses 4 to 10 times higher than the Germans they faced, depending on which operation you examined. Perhaps the battle exposed uncomfortable truths about Soviet military leadership, particularly Zhukov, whose reputation as the Soviet Union's greatest general couldn't survive honest scrutiny of his Rzhev record. Perhaps the outcome was too ambiguous. The Soviets had eventually occupied the Rzhev area, but only after the Germans voluntarily withdrew to shorten their defensive line. Calling it a victory required careful framing. The cover-up extended to unit records. Divisions that fought at Rzhev were later assigned to other operations, and their histories made no mention of their near destruction in the forests west of Moscow. The 39th Army, encircled and annihilated in July 1942, was officially reformed and its loss attributed to fighting elsewhere. Medical records showing casualty rates of 60 to 70% during certain operations were classified and remain partially sealed today. Even the German records, usually meticulous, contained gaps. Model's 9th Army files from the Rzhev period were selectively preserved, with some reports on Soviet attack casualties missing entirely, possibly removed during the chaos of Germany's collapse. What made the suppression particularly cruel was its impact on families. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were listed as missing in action at Rzhev. Their families received no death certificates, no confirmation, no closure. The state offered no information about where their sons and husbands had died, because acknowledging the details would mean acknowledging the scope of the disaster. Women searching for information about missing relatives were told that records had been lost. That chaos of war made accounting impossible. In reality, the records existed but were locked away. The soldiers had been disappeared twice. Once by the battle, once by bureaucracy. The 2007 construction site discovery forced a reckoning. Local news covered the story. Veterans groups mobilized. Families who had spent 60 years wondering where their grandfathers died suddenly had answers, and more questions. The regional government initially tried to minimize the find, suggesting it was a small burial ground from a minor skirmish. But the excavation kept expanding. 500 bodies. 1,000, 2,000. By the time archaeologists finished mapping the site, they estimated between 5,000 and 7,000 Soviet soldiers lay in that single mass grave, all killed in a 2-week period in late 1942. None had identification. None appeared in official burial records. They had been dumped in trenches and forgotten. This discovery was just one site among hundreds. Volunteer organizations calling themselves search battalions now work across the former Rzhev battlefield, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to locate remains. They recover between 2,000 and 3,000 bodies annually, decades after the battle. Many are still identifiable through personal effects: a letter in a pocket, a name etched into a belt buckle, a military paybook preserved in waterproof wrapping. The searchers notify families when they can, providing the closure the Soviet state denied. The work continues. Estimates suggest 300,000 Soviet soldiers from Rzhev remain unaccounted for, their bodies still scattered across the forests and fields of a battlefield that officially didn't exist. The ghost in Stalin's war was emerging from the ground, bone by bone, demanding to be remembered. December 5th, 1941. 15 kilometers from Moscow's city limits. German forward observers could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. For 3 days, temperatures had been dropping, minus 30 degrees Celsius at night, minus 20 during the day. The blitzkrieg that had smashed through Soviet defenses for 6 months had frozen solid. Then, at dawn, the Soviets counterattacked. Not with the disorganized, desperate assaults the Wehrmacht had grown accustomed to crushing, but with fresh divisions pulled from Siberia, men trained for winter warfare, equipped with skis and felt boots and T-34 tanks whose wide treads didn't sink in snow. The Germans began to fall back, not in panic, but in grudging recognition that they couldn't hold. By January, the front line had moved west 100 kilometers, and the Red Army was tasting something unfamiliar: sustained offensive success. But success created a problem. As Soviet forces pushed west and northwest from Moscow, they created a bulge in the German line, a salient in military terminology. The bulge centered on the city of Rzhev, a railway junction of 40,000 people that now found itself at the base of a German-held pocket 200 kilometers wide and 160 kilometers deep. The salient jutted toward Moscow like an arrowhead, pointed at the Soviet capital. Inside, it sat the bulk of German Army Group Center, the 9th Army under Walter Model and the 4th Army under Gotthard Heinrici, roughly 500,000 Wehrmacht soldiers. Surrounding the salient on three sides were Soviet forces, the Kalinin Front under Ivan Konev to the north, the Western Front under Georgy Zhukov to the south, over 700,000 Red Army troops. The geography was everyone's nightmare. For the Germans, the salient was indefensible in conventional terms. It created a front line of over 500 kilometers, where a straight defensive line would have been half that. It required enormous forces to hold, tying down troops desperately needed elsewhere, in the south, where the Wehrmacht was preparing a summer offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields, in North Africa, where Rommel was fighting for his life, on the home front, where production couldn't keep pace with losses. Every logistical calculation said, withdraw to a shorter line. Yet Hitler had ordered all Wehrmacht forces to hold their positions, and the Rzhev salient remained. For the Soviets, the salient was an opportunity and a threat. The opportunity: encircle and destroy Army Group Center, the same formation that had nearly captured Moscow. A successful operation would eliminate Germany's most powerful Eastern Front army group and potentially shorten the war by months. The threat: as long as the salient existed, German forces sat only 150 to 180 kilometers from Moscow. If the Wehrmacht somehow regained the offensive initiative, they could strike at the Soviet capital from this position. Stalin looked at the map and saw an abscess that needed to be lanced. Immediately, the salient's existence came down to a struggle between two visions of warfare. Hitler's vision was ideological. German soldiers didn't retreat because retreat signified weakness, and weakness was unacceptable to the master race. He had issued his Stand Fast order in December 1941, forbidding withdrawals even for tactical reasons. The order had arguably saved Army Group Center from total collapse during the Soviet winter offensive, convincing Hitler it was the right approach for all circumstances. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group Center, understood the strategic insanity of holding the salient, but couldn't convince Hitler to authorize a withdrawal. So, the salient remained, consuming resources like an open wound. Stalin's vision was attritional. He believed the Red Army could grind down German forces through sustained offensive operations, trading Soviet soldiers for German soldiers at ratios that favored the USSR, simply because the Soviet Union had more soldiers to trade. The mathematics were brutal but logical. The USSR could mobilize 8 to 10 million more men. Germany was already conscripting 40-year-olds and 16-year-olds. Every German casualty was irreplaceable. Soviet casualties were, in Stalin's calculation, acceptable if they achieved strategic objectives. The Rzhev salient offered him the perfect opportunity to test this theory. The salient's military importance stemmed from 3 railway lines that converged at Rzhev. These railways supplied the entire central sector of the German Eastern Front. Grain from occupied Ukraine, munitions from Germany, reinforcements from France, everything flowed through Rzhev's rail yards. Losing Rzhev would force the Wehrmacht to rely on longer, more vulnerable supply routes. It would also create a gap in the German line that Soviet forces could potentially exploit to drive west toward Smolensk and threaten the rear of German forces further south. Soviet military planners at the Stavka, the Supreme Command, looked at these railways and saw a strategic pressure point. Eliminate Rzhev, and Army Group Center might collapse. But there was a deeper psychological dimension. Rzhev had become symbolically important beyond its military value. For Stalin, erasing the salient meant erasing the closest point German forces had reached toward Moscow. It meant proving that the Red Army could conduct successful offensive operations, not just desperate defensive stands. For Hitler, holding the salient meant demonstrating that German will could overcome Soviet numbers. Both leaders had invested pride in this patch of forest and swamp. Neither was willing to compromise. The soldiers who would pay for this pride hadn't yet comprehended the price. The Salient's terrain made everything worse. This was an open steppe where tanks could maneuver and breakthroughs were possible. This was dense forest, interspersed with swamps that became impassable in spring and fall. Villages sat on slight elevations, the only dry ground for kilometers. Whoever controlled the villages controlled movement. The forests provided defensive cover, but made coordination nearly impossible. Attacking forces couldn't see more than 50 meters ahead. Artillery observers couldn't spot targets. Tank formations couldn't deploy. Infantry advances turned into blind, desperate close quarters, fighting where individual squads became isolated and were destroyed piecemeal. The terrain favored defenders enormously, which should have told Soviet planners something about the wisdom of attacking here. By late January 1942, both sides had committed to their positions. The Germans began fortifying. The Soviets began planning offensives. Neither side fully appreciated what they were creating, a killing ground that would consume armies for the next 14 months. The salient no one wanted had become the salient neither side could abandon. Maps at German and Soviet headquarters showed the Rzhev bulge outlined in red, marked with unit positions, supply routes, planned operations. Generals studied those maps, moving pieces around like a chess game. But this wasn't chess. This was about to become the bloodiest sustained combat operation of World War II, and it would happen in relative obscurity, fighting for objectives neither side could clearly articulate beyond destroy the enemy. The stage was set for catastrophe. February 3rd, 1942. A frozen trench line 6 kilometers west of Rzhev. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of the 9th Army, crouched in the mud, talking to a machine gun crew. Model was 41 years old, short, wiry, with a monocle that made him look like a caricature of a Prussian officer. But there was nothing comical about his presence. He visited the front lines constantly, often appearing in positions so exposed that his staff officers begged him to stay back. He carried a notebook and pencil. Every conversation with frontline soldiers went into the notebook. What do you see? Where do they attack? How do you survive? Model was building something unprecedented, a defensive system that would turn the Rzhev salient into a fortress more formidable than anything the Eastern Front had seen. Model understood what Hitler and the German High Command didn't. The stand fast order was suicide if applied literally. You couldn't just order soldiers to die in place and expect to hold territory, but you could create a defensive system so deep, so layered, so responsive that attackers would exhaust themselves before achieving penetration. Model's innovation was elastic defense in depth. Instead of concentrating forces in a single trench line that could be broken with sufficient force, he created 3 defensive belts stretching 30 kilometers back from the front. The forward security zone absorbed initial attacks. The main defensive zone, 15 kilometers deep, contained the primary fortifications. The rear defensive zone provided fallback positions and assembly areas for counterattacks. Attackers who broke through one belt found themselves facing another, and another, until they were too weak and disorganized to continue. The system required rethinking how every meter of ground was used. Model ordered every village in the salient fortified, not just defended, fortified. German combat engineers transformed peasant cottages into bunkers. They reinforced walls with logs and earth, creating structures that could withstand direct artillery hits. They built interconnecting trenches so defenders could move between buildings without exposing themselves. They positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that every approach to every village was covered from multiple angles. The specifications were precise. Bunker walls 2 meters thick using alternating layers of logs and earth. Overhead cover 1 meter thick, firing ports positioned to cover all approaches. By March, there were over 450 fortified villages in the salient, each one a miniature fortress. But fortifications alone weren't enough. Model's real genius was in his use of mobile reserves. Traditional defensive doctrine placed reserves far behind the front, requiring hours or days to commit them to battle. Model positioned his reserves only 10 to 15 kilometers behind threatened sectors, close enough to counterattack within hours of a Soviet breakthrough. He rotated divisions in and out of the line, so units in the rear were always rested and ready. When Soviet forces achieved a penetration, Model's system responded like a living organism. The forward positions would fight delaying actions, falling back slowly while calling in artillery. The main defensive belt would absorb the assault's momentum. Then, before the Soviets could consolidate their gains, German counterattack divisions would slam into their flanks. This wasn't passive defense. This was aggressive, dynamic warfare that punished every Soviet advance. The soldiers who manned this system were exhausted, outnumbered, often green replacements, but Model's doctrine gave them a fighting chance. A typical German division at Rzhev fielded about 10,000 men, significantly under strength compared to the authorized 15,000. They faced Soviet formations that, despite their own losses, could replace casualties faster than the Germans. Model compensated for numerical inferiority through superior positions and tactics. His infantry dug in deep. Trenches at Rzhev weren't the muddy ditches of World War I. They were sophisticated fortifications with dugouts that could shelter entire squads, communication trenches connecting positions, drainage systems to prevent flooding, even makeshift heating using captured Soviet stoves. Model's defensive philosophy was summed up in orders he issued to division commanders. Defend forward aggressively. Every meter of ground should be contested. Soviet forces should pay for every advance. But when a position became untenable, fall back to prepared positions rather than die in place. This pragmatism infuriated Hitler, but saved German lives. Model understood that in defensive warfare, the goal wasn't to hold every trench, it was to bleed the attacker dry. Soviet forces attacking Model's positions found themselves in a nightmare. They would overrun the first German trench after heavy casualties, only to discover it was a security outpost. The real defenses were a kilometer back. They would assault those, suffer more losses, break through, and find another line behind that. The artillery component of Model's system was equally sophisticated. German artillery at Rzhev operated on pre-planned fire missions. Every likely Soviet assembly area, every approach route, every open field was pre-registered as a target. When Soviet attacks began, German forward observers didn't need to spend time calculating coordinates. They simply radioed a target number and shells landed within minutes. Model also pioneered the use of fire chambers, kill zones where multiple artillery batteries could concentrate fire. Soviet units advancing into these chambers faced shells coming from 3 or 4 directions simultaneously, with nowhere to take cover. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet soldiers called these bombardments Black Death. The system's weakness was manpower. Model needed bodies to fill all these positions, and Germany didn't have infinite soldiers. He compensated through ruthless efficiency and by creating the impression of greater strength than actually existed. Dummy positions with wooden guns fooled Soviet reconnaissance. Units would defend a sector for a day, then quick march to another sector overnight to defend there, making it appear that reserves were everywhere. Model also employed brutal discipline. Soldiers who abandoned positions faced court-martial and execution. In Model's 9th Army, there was no distinction between retreat and desertion. Both got you shot. This created cohesion born of fear, but it was effective cohesion nonetheless. By April 1942, the transformation was complete. What had been a hastily held line in January was now a defensive system that would have impressed fortification engineers from any era. Model had taken terrain that favored neither side and engineered it into a defender's paradise. Soviet commanders looking at the Rzhev salient saw a German position that needed to be eliminated. What they couldn't see, was that Model had turned it into a trap. The salient appeared vulnerable, exposed, ready to be cut off and destroyed. That appearance would draw Soviet forces into a meat grinder that would destroy them instead. Model's fortress was ready. Now it needed only for the enemy to attack, and they would. Because on the other side of the wire, Georgy Zhukov was staring at the same maps Model studied, and Zhukov saw not a fortress, but an opportunity. He saw a bulge that could be pinched off. He saw German divisions that could be encircled. He saw a chance to prove that the Red Army had learned how to conduct offensive operations. What Zhukov didn't see was that he was about to feed his armies into the most efficient killing machine the Eastern Front would ever witness. The collision between Zhukov's offensive ambitions and Model's defensive genius was about to begin, and it would be measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. March 9th, 1942. The Kremlin. Stalin's private office. Georgy Zhukov stood before a wall-sized map of the Eastern Front, pointer in hand, explaining his plan to eliminate the Rzhev salient. Zhukov was 45 years old, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of grim determination. He had saved Moscow in December. He had orchestrated the successful winter counteroffensive. Now he wanted the Rzhev salient, and he wanted it with an intensity that bordered on personal vendetta. Stalin listened, smoking his pipe, asking occasional questions. Zhukov's plan was simple in conception: simultaneous attacks from north and south to cut off the salient at its base, trapping the entire German Ninth Army. Stalin approved. It was the beginning of Zhukov's obsession, a fixation that would consume armies. The first offensive began 12 days later. Operation Rzhev Vyazma, involving over 800,000 Soviet troops, aimed to encircle Army Group Center in a massive double envelopment. The operation followed standard Soviet doctrine: massive artillery preparation, infantry assault in dense waves, exploitation with mobile groups once breakthrough was achieved. What Zhukov hadn't accounted for was Model's defense in depth. Soviet infantry overran the first German positions after heavy fighting, then hit the second belt. The attack bogged down. Casualties mounted. After 3 weeks, Soviet forces had advanced only 5 to 8 kilometers at points, nowhere near the breakthrough needed for encirclement. Zhukov ordered the attacks to continue. They did. The casualty reports grew grimmer. The pattern that would define Rzhev was established. Soviet attacks began with artillery bombardments that turned forests into splinters and villages into rubble. 2,000 guns firing for 2 hours, the earth shaking, sound loud enough to rupture eardrums. Then silence. Then whistles, and Soviet infantry would rise from their trenches and advance across open ground. German machine guns would open fire. The Soviet first wave would collapse. The second wave would advance over their bodies. Sometimes they reached the German trenches. Sometimes they even held them for a few hours. Then Model's counterattack divisions would arrive, and the Soviets would be pushed back to their start lines, leaving thousands dead in no man's land. Zhukov's tactical approach revealed the fundamental disconnect between Soviet operational theory and battlefield reality. Soviet doctrine in 1942 emphasized mass and momentum, concentrate overwhelming force at a narrow point, achieve numerical superiority of 3-to-1 or higher, smash through enemy defenses, then exploit the breakthrough with mobile groups, tank corps, and cavalry that would drive deep into the German rear. It had worked against the Germans during the winter counteroffensive when Wehrmacht forces were frozen, exhausted, and overstretched. But Model's defensive system neutralized these advantages. Mass became a liability when attacking prepared positions. Soviet formations bunched up under artillery fire. Numerical superiority meant nothing when the terrain channeled attackers into kill zones. Momentum was impossible to sustain across 3 defensive belts. But Zhukov kept attacking. April, another offensive. May, another. June, another. Each one followed the same template with minor variations. Each one promised breakthrough. Each one ended with casualty reports showing 40 to 50% losses and minimal territorial gains. The divisions attacking at Rzhev were being bled white. A typical Soviet rifle division started an offensive with 8,000 to 10,000 men. After 2 weeks of combat at Rzhev, that same division might be down to 4,000 effectives. Divisions were pulled out of the line, refilled with conscripts, and sent back in. Some divisions were destroyed and reformed 3 times during the Rzhev campaign. The human cost was obscured by Soviet accounting practices. Official casualty reports distinguish between sanitary losses, wounded, and irrecoverable losses: dead, missing, captured. But at Rzhev, the ratio was abnormal. Typically, modern warfare produces 3 wounded for every soldier killed. At Rzhev, The ratio was closer to 2-1, sometimes even 1-1. This indicated that wounded soldiers were dying before they could be evacuated, bleeding out in shell craters, freezing in no man's land, or being hit again by artillery while trying to crawl back to Soviet lines. Medical services couldn't reach forward positions under fire. Wounded men lay where they fell. Many were buried where they died when new offensives churned up the same ground. Zhukov's use of penal battalions, Strafbat, added another layer of brutality. These units consisted of soldiers convicted of military crimes, political prisoners, and men from suspect ethnic groups. They were sent into attacks first, tasked with drawing German fire and triggering mines. Official doctrine said that Strafbat soldiers who survived an offensive and fought bravely would be redeemed and returned to regular units. In practice, Strafbat casualties at Rzhev approached 100%. They were expendable, and Zhukov expended them. Behind the Strafbat came regular infantry. Behind them came NKVD blocking detachments, interior ministry troops whose job was to shoot anyone retreating without orders. Soviet soldiers at Rzhev advanced knowing they might die to German fire ahead, or Soviet bullets behind. The question of Zhukov's motivation remains debated. Was he under pressure from Stalin to produce results at any cost? Certainly. Stalin demanded victory and didn't accept excuses about casualties. In Soviet military culture, commanders who complained about losses were seen as weak. But Zhukov also seemed personally invested in crushing the salient. His staff officers later recalled him studying maps late into the night, sketching new attack plans, convinced the next offensive would work. There was an element of pride. Zhukov had defeated the Germans at Moscow, and now the Germans were defying him at Rzhev. There was also an element of institutional momentum. Each failed offensive created pressure to launch another to justify the previous losses. Retreating or halting attacks would mean admitting those casualties achieved nothing. By summer 1942, Soviet casualties at Rzhev had exceeded 300,000, with virtually nothing to show for it. The salient remained intact. German forces held their positions. Yet, at Stavka meetings, Zhukov continued to present optimistic assessments. Breakthrough was imminent. One more push would crack Model's defenses. Stalin, planning a major summer offensive in the south toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus, began to see Rzhev as a distraction, but he authorized Zhukov to continue operations, perhaps recognizing that attacking at Rzhev tied down German forces that couldn't be redeployed to other sectors. The strategic logic was sound. The human cost was catastrophic. The divisions fed into the Rzhev meat grinder came from across the Soviet Union. Siberians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Russians from Moscow and Leningrad. Many were conscripts with 3 to 6 weeks of training. They were issued rifles, shown how to fix bayonets, and sent to the front. A typical replacement's journey, trained from Moscow to a railhead 30 kilometers behind the line, march forward at night, assigned to a company that had just lost 60% of its strength in the previous day's attack, given a few hours to dig in, then sent over the top at dawn. Survival measured in days, veterans measured in weeks. Those who lasted months were considered nearly miraculous. And through it all, Zhukov kept planning the next offensive, the one that would finally break Model's fortress and justify everything that had come before. The obsession had become self-sustaining, feeding on failure, demanding more blood. July 2nd, 1942, 5 kilometers west of the town of Bailey. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Bezugli's 39th Army had just punched through the 1st German defensive line, and Bezugli allowed himself a moment of hope. His 6 rifle divisions, 30,000 men, had been attacking for 2 days. The casualties were heavy, perhaps 5,000 already, but they had broken through. German positions that had held for months were crumbling. Forward units reported scattered resistance ahead. Bezugli radioed headquarters. Breakthrough achieved, requesting permission to exploit toward Rzhev. He was 11 kilometers from the city. Victory felt close. What Bezugli didn't know was that Model had been waiting for exactly this. The breakthrough was planned. The trap was set. Model's strategy for Operation Seydlitz, named after a Prussian general famous for desperate gambles, was to let Soviet forces penetrate his first defensive belt, then close pincers behind them, creating a pocket that could be systematically destroyed. He had positioned 6 divisions specifically for this operation, 3 to contain the Soviet penetration from the front, 3 to execute the encirclement from the flanks. The timing had to be perfect. Allow the Soviets to push in deep enough that they committed their reserves, then snap the trap shut before they realized what was happening. Model watched the battle from his headquarters, receiving updates every 30 minutes. Soviet forces were advancing exactly where he wanted them. On July 4th, he gave the order. Close the pocket. The German pincers moved with practiced efficiency. From north and south, Wehrmacht units that had seemed to be retreating suddenly wheeled inward. 39th Army supply lines, already tenuous across the first defensive belt, were cut within hours. Soviet radio intercepts crackled with confusion. Units that thought they were advancing toward Rzhev were receiving orders to defend against attacks from the rear. Bezugli realized the situation by evening of July 4th. His entire army was surrounded. The pocket was approximately 15 kilometers by 12, small enough that German artillery positioned outside could range every square meter. He immediately ordered his forces to establish a perimeter and prepared to break out. Inside the pocket, 30,000 Soviet soldiers found themselves in a contracting nightmare. Model's doctrine for pocket destruction was methodical. German artillery began firing into the pocket in fire chambers, pre-registered zones where multiple batteries concentrated fire. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill everyone immediately, but to prevent organization, prevent breakout attempts, and destroy Soviet will to resist. Every few hours, the bombardment would intensify for 15 minutes, turning a different section of the pocket into a moonscape. Soviet soldiers dug frantically, but the soil was thin over rock and foxholes filled with water. Overhead cover was minimal. Men died in their holes. Bezugli organized 3 breakout attempts in the first week. Each followed the same pattern. Assemble assault groups, concentrate on a narrow sector of the German ring, attack at night to minimize casualties from artillery. The July 5th breakout penetrated 2 kilometers into German positions before being stopped by machine gun fire and counterattack. 600 Soviet soldiers made it through the German lines. 4,000 died in the attempt. The July 7th attempt gained only 500 meters before collapsing. By July 9th, Bezugli's effective combat strength was down to about 20,000 men. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The pocket was shrinking daily as German infantry pushed inward from all sides. Relief attempts came from outside. 3 Soviet divisions, 20,000 more men, attacked the German encirclement from the east, trying to punch a corridor through to 39th Army. Model had anticipated this. He positioned his mobile reserves to block relief efforts while maintaining pressure on the pocket itself. The relief divisions hit, prepared German positions, and were slaughtered. They advanced across open ground into interlocking machine gun fire. German records from these engagements describe Soviet infantry attacking in waves of several hundred men, entire waves going down without reaching German trenches. After 4 days, the relief attempts were called off. The divisions had suffered 70% casualties and gained nothing. 39th Army was alone. The pocket's final week was systematic annihilation. German artillery had by now registered every square meter. They divided the pocket into grids and destroyed it, grid by grid. Soviet soldiers who had survived a week without resupply were out of ammunition, reduced to hand-to-hand combat when German infantry probed their perimeter. Water was scarce. The few wells in the pocket area were under German observation and direct fire. Wounded men received no medical care beyond what comrades could improvise. The sounds from inside the pocket, as described later by German soldiers who participated in the operation, were unlike anything they had experienced. Constant explosions, screams, confused shooting, as Soviet units fired at shadows. Desperate orders shouted over failing radios. July 12th. The pocket no longer existed as an organized military formation. Bezugli and his staff were dead, killed by artillery. Small groups of Soviet soldiers were still resisting in isolated strongpoints, but coherent command and control had ceased. German infantry moved through the pocket's remnants, accepting surrenders, finishing off resistance. The final count: 22,000 Soviet soldiers killed in action, 5,000 captured. Most of the captured were wounded. Of the original 30,000, approximately 3,000 escaped in small groups during the chaos. Men who slipped through German lines individually or in pairs, abandoning equipment, making their way east through forests. German casualties: 3,000, mostly wounded. The casualty ratio was roughly 10-1 in Germany's favor, but numbers don't capture what Operation Seydlitz demonstrated. It showed that Model's defensive system could do more than repel attacks. It could destroy entire Soviet armies. It showed that Soviet forces, despite numerical superiority and aggressive doctrine, could be outmaneuvered and encircled. Most importantly, it established a template. Model had created a reproducible method for dealing with Soviet offensives at Rzhev. Absorb the initial blow, encircle the penetrating forces, destroy them in detail. He would use this template again and again over the coming months. Each time, Soviet forces would attack. Each time, they would break through the first defensive line. Each time, they would be trapped and destroyed. The Soviet Stavka's reaction to Seydlitz's disaster revealed the larger problem. Instead of pausing to analyze what went wrong and develop new tactics, Zhukov and the command staff blamed Bazugli for tactical errors, blamed the relief forces for insufficient aggression, blamed everyone except the operational concept itself. The official lesson was that 39th Army had been too cautious, had failed to exploit its breakthrough fast enough. The solution was to attack again, but faster, with more aggression. This would become the pattern for Soviet operations at Rzhev. Failure, blame mid-level commanders, attack again, using the same methods. The meat grinder was just beginning to turn. August 15th, 1942. The village of Polkovo, population 312, located 8 kilometers behind German lines in the Rzhev Salient. Maria Ivanovna Kuznetsova crouched in the root cellar of what had been her family's home for 3 generations, listening to artillery pound the earth above. She was 36 years old, mother of 2 children who had been evacuated east before the Germans arrived, wife of a soldier who had disappeared during the winter fighting. The shelling had started before dawn and continued for hours. Not random firing, systematic grid-by-grid destruction that suggested both sides were fighting over Polkovo again. This was the 4th time in 6 months. The village had changed hands twice. Each time, it emerged more destroyed. By now, only 17 civilians remained, those too old, too sick, or too stubborn to flee. The battle zone between the German and Soviet lines had become a landscape where normal human existence was impossible. The pre-war population of the Rzhev salient area had been approximately 500,000 civilians. By August 1942, perhaps 150,000 remained. Some had fled east ahead of the German advance. Some had been evacuated by Soviet authorities. Some had been killed in the fighting. Some had been executed. The villages that dotted the region, farming communities that had existed for centuries, were being erased. Not just damaged, erased. Artillery from both sides treated every structure as a potential military position. Villages changed hands multiple times, and neither side had incentive to preserve civilian infrastructure. A village became rubble, then the rubble became a fortified position. Then more artillery turned it to smaller rubble. German occupation policy accelerated the destruction. Army Group Center wasn't just fighting a conventional war, it was implementing Nazi ideology in occupied territory. Villages suspected of harboring partisans faced collective punishment. The pattern was consistent. German security forces would enter a village, assemble the population, interrogate them about partisan activity, and if the answers weren't satisfactory, execute hostages and burn buildings. Operation Hanover, a major anti-partisan sweep in June 1942, documented the execution of over 10,000 civilians and the destruction of 43 villages. Operation Munich in September killed 5,000 more. The German reports used bureaucratic language: liquidated, rendered harmless, cleansed area. The reality was mass murder. The partisan war created an impossible situation for civilians. Soviet partisan groups, military units that had been cut off during the German advance, or political operatives inserted from Soviet-controlled territory, operated in the forests around Rzhev, attacking supply convoys, sabotaging railways, assassinating collaborators. By late 1942, partisan strength in the region approached 15,000 fighters. They needed food, shelter, information. Villages provided these or faced Soviet retaliation for collaboration. But providing aid to partisans invited German retaliation for resistance. Civilians were trapped between two forms of coercion, both lethal. The village of Olenino's fate illustrated the spiral. Population pre-war, 800. In April 1942, partisans ambushed a German supply column on the road outside Olenino, killing 23 soldiers. German security forces arrived 2 days later. They assembled the village in the square, selected 80 men of military age, shot them, and burned every building. The survivors fled into the forest. Some joined the partisans. What choice did they have? German forces later classified Olenino as a bandit village and made the ruins a free fire zone. Soviet forces retook the area in March 1943 and found mass graves. The village was never rebuilt. It existed on pre-war maps, but nowhere else. Starvation became as dangerous as violence. German occupation authorities requisitioned food aggressively, leaving civilian populations with minimal rations. The official allocation for non-working civilians in occupied areas was 100 grams of bread daily, about 2 slices. In practice, distributions were irregular and often less. People ate bark, roots, anything. The winter of 1942 to 1943 was especially brutal. Temperatures fell below -30°C for weeks. Villages without functioning buildings meant people lived in cellars or dugouts. Firewood required venturing into forests where patrols from both sides shot on sight. German records from the period note increased civilian deaths from malnutrition and exposure, bureaucratic language for mass starvation. Children suffered disproportionately. Many had been separated from parents during the chaos of combat or evacuation. They formed semi-feral groups, living in the ruins, scavenging battlefields for food and supplies. Both German and Soviet forces occasionally took in orphans. German units sometimes adopted children as mascots, feeding them from unit kitchens. Soviet partisan groups integrated older children as messengers and scouts, but most were left to fend for themselves. Post-war Soviet censuses of the Rzhev region showed demographic catastrophe among those born between 1935 and 1941. Over half were missing, presumed dead. The landscape itself became lethal in new ways. Mines were everywhere. Both armies laid extensive minefields, then lost track of them as front lines shifted. Unexploded ordnance littered fields, artillery shells that had failed to detonate, grenades, booby traps. Civilians trying to farm or scavenge were killed regularly. Water sources were contaminated, wells filled with debris, corpses, chemicals. Disease spread in conditions where sanitation had collapsed. Typhus outbreaks in the winter of 1942 killed thousands in both occupied and Soviet-controlled areas. Medical care was non-existent for civilians. German and Soviet medical services prioritized their own wounded. Civilians received nothing. Some tried to maintain humanity. In the village of Osuga, a group of women formed a collective to care for orphaned children. Hiding them in a bunker system they'd dug beneath a barn. They survived by scavenging at night, avoiding patrols, trading information to both sides in exchange for protection. When Soviet forces liberated Osuga in March 1943, they found 43 children alive, ranging from infants to teenagers. How many more such groups existed? How many failed? The records don't say. Most people who tried to survive in the battle zone left no trace. The cultural destruction was total. Churches were shelled, looted, or converted to military purposes. Libraries burned. Schools became barracks. The social fabric that held communities together disintegrated under pressure of occupation, collaboration, resistance, and violence. When Soviet forces finally secured the region in March 1943, They found entire districts where recognizable villages no longer existed, just scattered rubble and shell craters. Of the region's pre-war population of 500,000, fewer than 150,000 were accounted for. The rest were dead, missing, or displaced. 247 villages had been completely destroyed and were never rebuilt. The landscape had been returned to a pre-civilizational state, and the suffering of those who had lived through it remained, like the battle itself, largely unrecorded. These were the ghosts beneath the soldiers' ghosts, the civilians who disappeared into history without even the inadequate documentation that soldiers received. November 25th, 1942, 0300 hours. Across a front of 250 kilometers surrounding the Rzhev Salient, the largest artillery bombardment the Eastern Front had yet witnessed began. 24,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous roar that shattered windows in Rzhev, that was heard in Moscow 160 kilometers away. That left men on both sides temporarily deaf. Trees in the forests vaporized. German bunkers that had survived months of shelling disintegrated. The bombardment continued for 2 hours. Then silence. Then whistles. Then 1.9 million Soviet soldiers rose from their trenches and advanced. Operation Mars, Zhukov's masterpiece offensive, had begun. It would destroy more Soviet lives than any single operation of the war, and then be erased from history. Zhukov had been planning Mars for months. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Simultaneous attacks from 3 directions to cut off the Rzhev, Salient at its base, and encircle Army Group Center. From the northwest, the Kalinin front under Konev would strike toward Rzhev. From the south, the western front under Zhukov himself would attack toward Sychevka. From the east, a supporting operation would pin German forces in place. The operation would employ more troops than the simultaneous Stalingrad encirclement, 1.9 million men compared to Stalingrad's 1 million. It would use 3,300 tanks, an armored force larger than Germany's entire Eastern Front allocation. Stalin had allocated resources lavishly because Zhukov promised results. The destruction of Army Group Center within 2 weeks. The first day seemed to validate optimism. Soviet forces broke through German first-line positions at multiple points. The Kalinin Front's 1st Mechanized Corps, equipped with new T-34 tanks, penetrated 15 kilometers near Bely, the deepest Soviet advance at Rzhev in 9 months. Western Front troops crossed the Vazuza River and pushed into German rear areas. Zhukov's headquarters received reports of German units retreating in disorder. By evening, Soviet officers were congratulating each other on the breakthrough. Forward units radioed that Rzhev was within reach. Exploitation forces prepared to advance. Model, at 9th Army headquarters, appeared calm. His staff officers later recalled him studying maps and saying simply, "Let them come deeper." Day 2 revealed the reality. Soviet forces that had advanced beyond the first German defensive belt found themselves hitting the second belt. Fortifications they hadn't known existed. The retreating German units had been executing planned withdrawals to secondary positions. Model's mobile reserves began counterattacking. 1st Mechanized Corps, which had driven 15 kilometers toward Bely, suddenly found German formations attacking its flanks from north and south. The Soviets had punched into a salient within the salient, and Model was closing the pincers. The Corps commander radioed for support. None was available. The formations that should have been exploiting the breakthrough were stuck fighting for the same villages the first wave had captured. Model's counteroffensive at Bely demonstrated everything he had learned from 10 months of defensive warfare. He committed 2 panzer divisions and 4 infantry divisions to the encirclement, over 60,000 men and 200 tanks. They attacked in a coordinated pincer from both flanks of the Soviet penetration, moving fast to cut the corridor before Soviet reinforcements could widen it. German artillery laid down curtain fire to isolate the pocket from relief attempts. Luftwaffe dive bombers, pulled from other sectors specifically for Mars, pounded Soviet positions. Within 48 hours, 1st Mechanized Corps was surrounded. Of its 230 tanks, half were destroyed in the initial encirclement. The rest were trapped. The pocket battles that followed resembled sidelets on a larger scale. 1st Mechanized Corps, plus 3 rifle divisions that had been caught in the encirclement, represented about 35,000 Soviet troops. They were cut off in a pocket approximately 10 kilometers by 8. Model's forces compressed the pocket systematically. Soviet breakout attempts failed with catastrophic losses. Relief attempts from outside fared no better. Zhukov committed the 6th Tank Corps to break through and link up with 1st Mechanized. They hit prepared German positions and lost over half their tanks in 2 days without reaching the pocket. By November 30th, 1st Mechanized Corps had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. German forces destroyed or captured all 230 tanks. Casualties: over 20,000 killed, 5,000 captured. But the Belai disaster was only one sector. Across the entire Mars operational area, Soviet forces were bleeding. The attacks near Sychevka in the south bogged down in Model's defensive belts. Infantry divisions suffered 50 to 60% casualties, trying to advance through minefields and interlocking machine gun positions. Tank brigades drove into anti-tank gun concentrations and were annihilated. Soviet armor at Mars lost over 1,000 tanks in the first week. German casualty reports noted that Soviet infantry continued attacking with almost mechanistic persistence, wave after wave, even when it was obvious the attacks couldn't succeed. Model later wrote that Soviet discipline under these conditions was actually frightening, men advancing towards certain death because they'd been ordered to. Zhukov, at Western Front headquarters, faced a decision by December 1st. Mars had cost over 100,000 dead in 6 days with minimal gains. The forces were exhausted, disorganized, out of supplies. German defenses hadn't cracked. They'd hardened. The rational choice was to halt the offensive, regroup, and try again later with new tactics. But Zhukov had promised Stalin the destruction of Army Group Center. He had committed the Red Army's prestige to this operation. International press had been alerted to a major Soviet offensive. Halting would be admitting failure. He ordered attacks to continue. They did, for another 19 days, with diminishing force and mounting casualties. The final casualty figures for Operation Mars shocked even Stalin. Official numbers, which historians believe were underreported, listed 335,000 Soviet casualties, 100,000 killed, 235,000 wounded or missing. German casualties, approximately 40,000. The casualty ratio exceeded 8-1, among the worst of any major Soviet operation. Materially, Mars consumed 1,500 tanks, over 800 aircraft, and 3,000 artillery pieces. Entire divisions had been reduced to battalion strength. Some units lost 80% of their combat power. For all this, Soviet forces gained no significant territory. The Rzhev salient remained intact. Army Group Center remained combat effective. The operation that was supposed to mirror and surpass Stalingrad had achieved nothing except mass death. The suppression began immediately. While Operation Uranus, the Stalingrad encirclement, was succeeding simultaneously with Mars's failure, Stalin and Zhukov saw an opportunity. Mars could be reframed as a diversion for Stalingrad. The massive casualties weren't a defeat. They were a sacrifice to tie down German forces while Uranus succeeded. This narrative required careful management. Casualty figures for Mars were classified. Unit records were edited. Veterans were quietly discouraged from discussing the operation. In official histories, Mars appeared as a footnote, a diversionary operation in the Rzhev-Sychevka sector, described in a single paragraph. Stalingrad received chapters, but the men who fought at Mars knew the truth. They knew they hadn't been a diversion. They knew they'd been committed to a full-scale offensive that failed catastrophically. They knew the breakthrough had been promised and then denied. The survivors carried this knowledge back to their units, spreading understanding that couldn't be suppressed by official propaganda. The Rzhev salient was a graveyard. Zhukov's tactics didn't work, and the promises of breakthrough were lies. This knowledge would inform Soviet combat effectiveness, or lack thereof, for the rest of the Rzhev campaign. Morale, already battered, plummeted. Soldiers at Rzhev began operating under the assumption that they were being sent to die for objectives that couldn't be achieved. Often, they were right. Operation Mars ended on December 20th, 1942. The meat grinder would continue for 3 more months, but Mars represented the peak of slaughter, and the point where the Red Army's manpower advantage began to look less like an asset and more like permission to waste lives. January 8th, 1943. 7 kilometers west of Rzhev, Senior Sergeant Viktor Morozov commanded a burial detail, 12 men with shovels, assigned to clear bodies from the November battlefields, before spring thaw made the work impossible. The ground was frozen solid, 40 centimeters down to bedrock. They couldn't dig proper graves. Instead, they collected corpses and stacked them in shell craters, covering them with whatever earth could be scraped up. Morozov had been doing this for 3 weeks. He'd stopped counting bodies after the first 1,000. What haunted him wasn't the number, it was the positions. Frozen Soviet soldiers lay in attack formations. Lines of men cut down mid-advance, their bodies preserved by cold in the exact moment of death. Some still gripped rifles. Some had hands raised as if warding off bullets. They looked alive, just sleeping, until you tried to move them and realized they were frozen solid. The winter of 1942 to 1943 at Rzhev became a nightmare that exceeded even the combat itself. Temperatures dropped to -30°C regularly, falling to -40 during cold snaps that lasted days. Snow accumulated in drifts 3 meters deep. The front lines barely moved, creating a static situation where both armies simply tried to survive. But survival in these conditions required resources neither side adequately possessed. Soviet logistics prioritized ammunition and fuel. Food and winter clothing came second. German supply lines were overstretched across the entire Eastern Front. The Rzhev Salient received minimal allocation of winter gear. Soldiers on both sides froze in their positions. The Soviet experience was particularly brutal. Frontline units received official rations of 400 grams of bread, 100 grams of meat, and basic tea daily. In practice, supplies often failed to arrive for 3 or 4 days at a time. Soldiers supplemented with whatever they could scavenge, grain from abandoned villages, potatoes frozen in fields, occasionally horse meat from dead animals. Men lost weight rapidly. Medical inspections in January 1943 found frontline troops averaging 10 to 15 kilograms below healthy weight. This malnutrition made them more susceptible to cold, creating a death spiral where the weaker you got, the faster you froze. Trench foot and frostbite hospitalized thousands. Soviet soldiers often lacked proper winter boots. They wore thin leather boots wrapped in cloth rags for insulation. When boots got wet from snow, or standing water in trenches, the cloth froze, and feet inside froze with it. Medical battalions behind the lines performed amputations by candlelight. Toes, feet, sometimes entire legs turned black with frostbite. In January alone, 9th Army Medical Services evacuated over 15,000 Soviet soldiers for cold casualties, a number that exceeded combat wounded for that month. Many died of gangrene before reaching hospitals. The ratio of wounded to killed at Rzhev was abnormally low, approximately 2 to 1 instead of the typical 3 or 4 to 1, because wounded men died of exposure before evacuation. German forces faced similar conditions with slightly better equipment, but worse morale. Wehrmacht soldiers had winter clothing, but it was designed for garrison duty in Germany, not extended frontline exposure in Russian winter. Soldiers wore everything they owned in layers. Undergarments, uniform, overcoat, blanket wrapped around shoulders, whatever could be looted from Soviet dead. German bunkers had heating systems improvised from captured Soviet stoves. Burning scavenged wood, but fuel was scarce. Many positions went unheated for days. Soldiers developed a rotation, 2 hours in the bunker warming up, 4 hours on watch in the cold, repeat. Sentries froze to death at their posts if they fell asleep. The no-man's land between German and Soviet lines became a corpse field. Bodies from the summer and fall offensives, tens of thousands of them, had been left where they fell because neither side could safely retrieve them under fire. Winter snow covered them, creating a deceptive white landscape. As temperatures fluctuated, thaws partially exposed the dead. Soviet and German soldiers reported seeing hands or feet protruding from snowdrifts. sometimes entire bodies that had been frozen into the ice of shell craters. In spring, when the snow finally melted, the sight was indescribable. Thousands upon thousands of bodies, many unidentifiable, covering the ground in such density that walking between positions meant stepping over or on human remains. Soviet penal companies continued to be used for the grimmest tasks. Mine-clearing operations sent Strafbat soldiers walking in line abreast across suspected minefields. The theory was that their weight would trigger mines, clearing paths for assault troops. In practice, it was execution by a different method. Winter made it worse. Mines were buried under snow, invisible, and frozen ground meant explosions were more lethal because shrapnel couldn't be absorbed by soft earth. A typical mine-clearing operation might send 50 Strafbat soldiers across a 100-meter field. 20 would make it across. The rest would be killed or wounded by mines. The wounded were often left in the minefield. Retrieving them meant more casualties. They froze to death calling for help that wouldn't come. Medical conditions behind the lines were medieval. Field hospitals operated in tents or damaged buildings without adequate heating. Wounded men lay on straw, sometimes directly on frozen ground. Surgeons worked in near darkness. Electricity was unavailable. Kerosene lanterns provided minimal light. Anesthesia was rationed and often unavailable. Amputations were performed with soldiers held down by orderlies, while surgeons worked as fast as possible. The screaming from field hospitals was constant. Infection was nearly universal. Antibiotics didn't exist. Antiseptic was scarce, and operating in unsterile conditions meant wounds inevitably became infected. Mortality rates for serious wounds approached 50%. Men survived the combat only to die of gangrene or sepsis days later. The psychological impact was crushing. Soldiers who had survived combat through summer and fall now faced an enemy they couldn't fight: the cold. It killed without warning, without mercy. You could dig in perfectly, follow all procedures, and still wake up with frostbitten feet because your boots got wet. Or you wouldn't wake up at all because hypothermia took you during the night. Soviet soldiers developed a saying: "The cold doesn't need orders from Berlin." It became clear that surviving Rzhev required luck more than skill, and luck was a finite resource. Desertion rates increased. Men would rather face NKVD blocking detachments than another month in the frozen trenches. By February, both armies had reached a breaking point. German intelligence estimated Soviet forces in the Rzhev sector had lost 30% of their strength to cold-related casualties since December. German 9th Army reported similar percentages. Neither side was capable of major offensive operations. The front lines remained static, not because of strategic stalemate, but because the soldiers were too exhausted, too cold, too broken to attack. Model submitted reports to Army Group Center requesting either reinforcements or permission to withdraw to a shorter defensive line. Hitler denied both. Stalin ordered Zhukov to prepare spring offensives. Both leaders seemed detached from the reality their soldiers inhabited. The winter of corpses created a generation of survivors who would never speak about what they'd endured. Veterans later described that winter as worse than the combat. At least in battle, you had agency, you could shoot back. Against the cold, you were helpless. The bodies stacked in shell craters, the amputations by candlelight, the men who froze to death on watch. None of this appeared in official histories. The Soviet narrative emphasized heroic resistance. The German narrative emphasized professional military competence. Neither acknowledged the simple, brutal truth. The winter of 1942 to 1943 at Rzhev was survival at its most primitive, and it killed as many soldiers as the battles did. The spring thaw would reveal the scale of death in ways that shocked even hardened troops. But by then, new offensives were being planned, new soldiers were arriving at the front, and the meat grinder was preparing to turn again. February 7th, 1943, Soviet Maskirovka headquarters, 30 kilometers east of Rzhev. Colonel Dmitry Petrov supervised the construction of an entire phantom army. His team had spent 3 weeks building dummy tanks, wooden frames covered with canvas, painted to look real from aerial reconnaissance. They'd constructed fake artillery positions, logs shaped like gun barrels protruding from earthen revetments. They'd established radio networks broadcasting fake communications about fictional divisions massing for attack. Petrov's assignment was elegant in its deception. Make the Germans believe Operation Mars was about to be repeated on an even larger scale. Make Model think 800,000 Soviet troops were preparing to assault the Rzhev salient in March. The goal wasn't to actually attack, it was to fix German forces in place while Soviet resources were redirected elsewhere. The phantom attack had to look real enough to paralyze German decision-making. Soviet maskirovka, military deception, had evolved dramatically since the war's start. Early Soviet attempts at deception were crude. Fake tanks that wouldn't fool anyone closer than 1,000 meters. Radio disciplines so poor that German signals intelligence could track actual unit movements with precision. By 1943, Soviet deception officers had learned from their failures. They studied German reconnaissance methods and tailored deceptions to exploit them. German aerial reconnaissance typically flew at 3,000 meters. At that altitude, a well-constructed dummy tank was indistinguishable from a real one. German signals intelligence listened for radio traffic patterns. So, Soviet deception units created realistic traffic using proper protocols and codes. The goal was creating a convincing operational picture. The dummy installations around Rzhev were remarkably sophisticated. 500 fake tanks were positioned in assembly areas that German reconnaissance would logically expect Soviet armor to use. 2,000 fake artillery pieces were distributed in battery positions following proper Soviet tactical doctrine. Actual tank units were moved at night into positions where they'd be photographed by German reconnaissance, then moved out and replaced by dummies, creating the impression that Soviet armor concentration was growing daily. Radio operators broadcast fake messages about supply deliveries, unit rotations, commander meetings. The communications were mundane enough to seem real, but frequent enough to suggest major activity. German intelligence took the bait. Wehrmacht reconnaissance flights over Soviet positions photographed the dummy installations and reported massing Soviet forces. Signals intelligence picked up increased radio traffic and interpreted it as preparation for major offensive operations. By mid-February, 9th Army intelligence estimated Soviet forces around Rzhev at 40 to 50 divisions, roughly 600,000 to 800,000 men. The estimate was approximately 4 times the actual strength. Model's intelligence chief presented the analysis with high confidence. The Soviets were preparing to repeat Operation Mars, possibly on a larger scale, with an attack expected in early to mid-March. Model's response revealed the success of Soviet deception. He immediately requested reinforcements from Army Group Center. He repositioned his mobile reserves to counter the expected Soviet axes of attack. He ordered additional fortifications constructed in sectors where Soviet buildup appeared heaviest. He redirected Luftwaffe reconnaissance to monitor Soviet assembly areas. Every action Model took was tactically correct, given the intelligence he had. But the intelligence was manufactured. The massive Soviet attack he was preparing to counter didn't exist. The actual Soviet forces around Rzhev were minimal, mostly depleted divisions recovering from Mars casualties. At OKH, German High Command, the intelligence from Rzhev created strategic problems. Model was requesting 5 additional divisions to reinforce the salient. Germany didn't have 5 divisions to spare. Every reserve was committed to other operations, preparing for the Kursk offensive, reinforcing Army Group South in Ukraine, holding positions across the entire Eastern Front. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group Center, reviewed the situation and made a remarkable decision. The Rzhev salient was strategically untenable, regardless of whether the Soviets attacked. The correct response wasn't reinforcement. It was withdrawal. On February 6, 1943, OKH authorized Operation Buffel, the evacuation of the Rzhev salient. The irony was perfect. Soviet deception had convinced Model that a massive attack was imminent, which convinced German High Command that holding the salient required resources they couldn't provide, which led them to authorize the withdrawal the Soviets had been trying to force for 14 months. The deception achieved the strategic objective without firing a shot. But there was an additional layer. The actual Soviet forces around Rzhev didn't know about the deception operation. Frontline units were genuinely preparing for another offensive, albeit a smaller one than Mars. When German forces began withdrawing in early March, Soviet commanders initially thought it was a trap, that Model was executing another operational deception to draw them into encirclements. Soviet operational planning for the actual spring offensive showed how thoroughly Mars had damaged Red Army capabilities at Rzhev. Instead of the 1.9 million soldiers committed to Mars, the March offensive would employ only about 150,000, 15 divisions. Instead of promises to destroy Army Group Center, objectives were modest: advance 10 to 15 kilometers, pressure German positions, prevent them from redeploying forces to other sectors. The planning documents were cautious, almost tentative. Zhukov was no longer involved. Command had shifted to Konev for Kalinin Front operations. The swagger that characterized Mars planning was gone, replaced by grim pragmatism. German planning for Buffel was equally careful. Model had studied Soviet pursuit tactics and knew that a disorganized withdrawal would invite catastrophe. The Soviets would detect the movement, attack retreating columns, and turn withdrawal into rout. Model's plan required withdrawing in stages, holding forward positions with rear guards while pulling back the bulk of forces to prepared fallback lines, then leapfrogging the rear guards back through those lines, repeating the process until the entire army was behind the new defensive position. The timeline was aggressive. Evacuate 485,000 men, 3,500 artillery pieces, and all heavy equipment from the salient in 3 weeks. The preparations were meticulous. Engineers prepared demolitions for every bridge, every railway line, every building of any value. The plan required destroying infrastructure so thoroughly that Soviet forces couldn't immediately use it for pursuit. Rzhev itself, the city that had given its name to the salient, was to be leveled, not damaged, leveled. Every building demolished, every cellar filled, every street blocked. The city would cease to exist as urban terrain. Model's orders were explicit: leave nothing the Soviets could use. The scorched earth policy that Wehrmacht forces had employed during the winter 1941 retreat would be repeated, but more systematically. Soviet intelligence detected anomalies by late February. German radio traffic patterns changed, less tactical chatter, more administrative communications suggesting logistics movements. Partisan reports indicated increased German vehicle movements heading west. Reconnaissance patrols found German positions less heavily manned than expected. But Soviet command couldn't interpret these signals coherently. Was this the prelude to a German offensive elsewhere? A redeployment to counter Soviet operations in other sectors? Or withdrawal? The possibility of withdrawal seemed least likely. German forces had held the salient for 14 months through catastrophic battles. Why abandon it now? The phantom attack had achieved its purpose, but in an unexpected way. It hadn't prevented German withdrawal. It had accelerated the German decision to withdraw by making the salient's defense appear impossibly expensive. Soviet deception planners had hoped to fix German forces in place. Instead, they'd convinced German command that those forces needed to be extracted. In the end, both sides got what they wanted. The Germans shortened their line and freed up divisions. The Soviets would claim the salient as liberated territory. The massive casualties of the previous 14 months would be justified post hoc as necessary for this outcome. History would record it as Soviet victory. The soldiers who died taking and retaking the same square kilometers of forest and swamp would become statistics in a larger narrative, and the deception that helped end the battle would remain classified for decades. Another ghost in a campaign full of ghosts. March 1st, 1943, 2300 hours, 3 kilometers west of Rzhev. Oberst Heinrich Gerlach commanded the rear guard, 2 infantry battalions and an assault gun company tasked with holding the outer defensive line, while the 9th Army withdrew behind them. Gerlach had been issued precise instructions: hold until 400 hours March 2nd, then withdraw to the next defensive line 8 kilometers west, arriving by 600 hours. The timing was critical. If rear guards withdrew too early, Soviet forces would detect the movement and pursue. If they withdrew too late, they'd be cut off. Gerlach watched his chronometer. At midnight, the artillery behind him went silent. The guns were moving. In 4 hours, he would move too. This was the beginning of Operation Büffel, the most successful retrograde operation the Wehrmacht would conduct on the Eastern Front. Model's withdrawal plan was a masterpiece of military logistics. 485,000 men, 3,500 artillery pieces, 800 tanks and assault guns, and thousands of vehicles needed to move west over roads that were barely passable, through terrain contested by Soviet forces and partisan groups, while maintaining the appearance of normal defensive operations to avoid triggering Soviet pursuit. The plan divided the salient into sectors, each with its own withdrawal timeline. Rear echelon units, supply depots, hospitals, administrative elements began moving west on February 28th, before the official start date. Frontline combat units would withdraw in stages, with each stage covered by designated rear guards. The deception component was as important as the logistics. German forces maintained normal patrol activity, normal artillery fire, normal radio traffic. Defensive positions were manned at full strength visibly from Soviet observation posts. What the Soviets couldn't see was that these full-strength positions were often held by skeleton crews. One squad manning positions built for a company, using distributed weapons to create the impression of more defenders. The actual combat units were already 5 to 10 kilometers back, preparing their next defensive line. Soviet reconnaissance reported German positions as normally manned and showed no indication of withdrawal preparation. The demolitions began at dawn on March 2nd. German combat engineers detonated prepared charges along 329 kilometers of railway line, rendering the tracks unusable. They destroyed 1,247 bridges, everything from major river crossings to small culverts over streams. The goal was to slow Soviet pursuit by making logistics impossible. A pursuing force needs supplies, and supplies require transportation. Without railways and without bridges, Soviet forces would be limited to what they could carry, or what could be brought forward on foot. This would buy the withdrawing Germans precious days. Rzhev's destruction was systematic and total. Engineers had placed demolition charges in every significant building over the preceding week. On March 3rd, as the last German units pulled out of the city, the charges detonated. Pre-war Rzhev had been a city of 54,000 people with substantial wooden and brick architecture, Orthodox churches, a railway station, administrative buildings. Post-demolition Rzhev was rubble. Aerial reconnaissance later showed not a single intact structure. The destruction was so complete that Soviet forces entering the city found it difficult to determine where streets had been. The rubble was booby-trapped. Delayed action explosives and tripwires meant that clearing the city would cost Soviet combat engineers casualties for weeks. The withdrawal's first stage went perfectly. Soviet forces detected the movement on March 2nd when reconnaissance patrols found German frontline positions abandoned. But by the time Soviet commanders confirmed the withdrawal and organized pursuit, German forces were already 15 to 20 kilometers west, behind prepared defensive lines. Soviet pursuit forces, mostly cavalry and light infantry, that could move without heavy logistics, ran into German rear guards positioned exactly to delay such forces. The rear guard battles were vicious but brief. Germans would hold a position for 2 to 4 hours, inflict maximum casualties on Soviet advance elements, then withdraw before being flanked or overwhelmed. Model's use of terrain demonstrated his tactical genius. The withdrawal route passed through villages and terrain features that naturally channeled pursuit forces into kill zones. German rear guards fortified these positions overnight, waited for Soviet forces to advance into range, engaged them with artillery and automatic weapons until Soviet forces deployed for attack, then withdrew before the attack materialized. This delay and withdraw tactic frustrated Soviet commanders who found themselves constantly preparing to assault positions that were abandoned before attacks could be launched. The delays accumulated. Each rear guard action cost Soviet forces 2 to 4 hours of movement time, and with multiple rear guards across the withdrawal route, pursuit slowed to a crawl. Soviet casualties during the pursuit revealed the effectiveness of German tactics. Advance guard units, typically rifle companies reinforced with machine guns, suffered 30 to 40% casualties in the first week of pursuit. They were running into pre-registered German artillery fire, prepared ambush positions, and minefields. The German rear guards accepted minimal losses, typically 10 to 15%, because they weren't fighting to hold ground, just to delay. Soviet commanders found themselves in the frustrating position of trading casualties for empty terrain. Villages were liberated only after German forces had demolished everything of value and moved on. The human cost of the withdrawal extended beyond combat casualties. German forces evacuated all able-bodied males aged 15 to 55 from the areas they controlled, forcing them to march west into German-controlled territory where they'd be used as forced labor. This wasn't unique to Buffel. Forced labor deportation was standard German practice in occupied Soviet territory, but the scale at Rzhev was notable. Approximately 18,000 Soviet civilians were forcibly evacuated during Buffel, removed from their homes at gunpoint, and marched west in columns guarded by rear echelon troops. Many died during the march from exposure, exhaustion, or summary execution if they couldn't maintain pace. By March 15th, 2 weeks into the operation, the withdrawal was ahead of schedule. Ninth Army had pulled back over 100 kilometers, shortening its defensive line from approximately 500 kilometers to 270 kilometers. The freed-up forces, 22 divisions, were being redeployed to other sectors. German casualties during the withdrawal were remarkably light, approximately 15,000, mostly wounded, with very few killed or captured. The logistical achievement was extraordinary. Virtually all heavy equipment had been successfully evacuated. Not a single artillery piece or tank was lost to enemy action during the withdrawal. Soviet pursuit forces entered what had been the Rzhev Salient, finding devastation. Villages were destroyed. Infrastructure was demolished. The land had been mined extensively. German engineers had scattered anti-personnel mines in fields, forests, and along roads. Soviet advance elements suffered constant casualties from these mines. But the most disturbing discovery was the extent of mass graves. As Soviet troops moved through areas that had been behind German lines, they found burial sites containing thousands of bodies. Soviet soldiers from battles fought months earlier, civilians from anti-partisan operations, evidence of massacres and executions. The graves were often unmarked, the bodies sometimes burned, making identification impossible. The final stage of Buffel completed on March 22nd. German forces established their new defensive line along the Dnieper River and prepared positions. Model conducted after-action reviews and concluded the operation had been a complete success. The army had been extracted intact, casualties were minimal, and the new line was far more defensible than the old salient. Soviet forces occupied the former salient and claimed victory. They had liberated the territory. But the cost-benefit analysis was damning. 14 months of combat, over 1 million Soviet casualties. To gain territory the Germans had voluntarily abandoned. The landscape they'd won was destroyed, unusable for months. The civilians they'd liberated were mostly gone, dead, or deported. They'd captured no significant German forces, no equipment, achieved no encirclements. Pravda ran headlines celebrating the liberation of Rzhev. The articles praised Soviet military prowess and described German forces fleeing in panic. The reality, a successful, well-executed German withdrawal that achieved all its objectives, was omitted. Soviet military leadership faced an uncomfortable truth. After 14 months and catastrophic casualties, the Rzhev salient had been eliminated not through Soviet operational success, but through German strategic choice. The Germans had decided to leave, and Soviet forces couldn't stop them from executing that decision successfully. This reality was incompatible with the narrative of Soviet military dominance. So, the narrative was adjusted, and Operation Buffel became a footnote while the liberation became the story. The meat grinder had stopped turning, but the lies about what it had accomplished were just beginning. March 3rd, 1943, 1400 hours. Captain Ivan Bailov's reconnaissance company entered Rzhev from the east, the first Soviet unit to reach the city center. Bailov had been briefed to expect resistance, street fighting, snipers, rear guards covering the German withdrawal. Instead, he found silence. His men advanced through streets that no longer existed, picking their way through rubble that reached second-story height. Not a single building stood intact, not one. Belov had fought through Stalingrad and thought he understood urban destruction, but Stalingrad at least had walls, had recognizable structures. Rzhev had been reduced to crushed brick and splintered wood. His radio man tried to report their position using street names from the pre-war map, but the streets themselves had been obliterated. They were standing somewhere in what had been a city of 54,000 people. Now the population was zero, and the city was rubble. The first Soviet troops entering the former Rzhev salient found a landscape that defied description. Villages they'd fought over for months existed only as foundations and debris. The forests had been shattered by artillery, reduced to acres of shattered tree stumps and shell craters. The fields were contaminated with unexploded ordnance, broken equipment, and bodies. Everything of military or economic value had been destroyed or removed. Water wells had been poisoned or filled with debris. Bridges were demolished. Roads were cratered. The Germans had left nothing, no shelter, no infrastructure, no resources. Soviet quartermasters surveying the area reported that it would take months to make the region even minimally habitable. The civilian toll became apparent as Soviet authorities tried to account for the population. Pre-war census records showed the Rzhev district containing approximately 500,000 people across the city and surrounding villages. Soviet forces found fewer than 15,000 civilians in the entire area. Elderly invalids mostly, people too sick or too stubborn to have fled or been evacuated. The rest were gone. Some had evacuated east ahead of German occupation. Some had been killed in the fighting or in anti-partisan reprisals. Some had been deported west by German forces during Withdrawal. Many were simply missing, their fates unknown and unknowable. The demographic catastrophe was nearly total, 97% population loss. Rzhev specifically told the story in miniature. City population in 1941, 54,000. Population when Soviet forces arrived, 150 people. Most were elderly women living in cellars and ruins. They reported that German forces had forcibly evacuated all able-bodied people in late February, marching them west under guard. Those who couldn't march, the elderly, the severely ill, some children, were left behind. Soviet authorities conducted interviews trying to document what had happened during the occupation. The accounts describe systematic looting, forced labor, arbitrary executions, starvation conditions. Several elderly survivors mentioned mass graves in the forest outside town, but couldn't or wouldn't provide specific locations. The military's response was to stage a liberation narrative. On March 6th, a carefully choreographed victory parade marched through partially cleared streets of Rzhev for newsreel cameras. Soviet soldiers in clean uniforms marched in formation past rubble piles. Red flags were planted on the ruins of the railway station. Commanders gave speeches about the heroic liberation of Soviet territory. The newsreels were distributed to cinemas across the Soviet Union, showing jubilant soldiers celebrating victory. What the cameras didn't show, the mass graves being discovered daily, the near-total absence of civilians, the extent of destruction, the minimal German equipment captured, the fact that this victory came from German withdrawal rather than Soviet operational success. Stalin's reaction to Rzhev's outcome was pragmatic and cynical. At a March 8th Stavka meeting, Zhukov and other commanders presented the results. The salient had been eliminated. Soviet forces controlled the territory. German forces had been defeated and forced to retreat. Stalin listened and then made a critical decision. The casualty figures would be classified. Official announcements would describe the Rzhev operations as a successful offensive that liberated Soviet territory. The specific cost, 1.3 million Soviet casualties by conservative estimates, would not be published. Unit records would be edited to distribute these casualties across multiple operations, rather than concentrating them at Rzhev. The battle would be minimized in official histories. The suppression required coordination across multiple bureaucracies. The Red Army's historical section received instructions to treat Rzhev as a minor supporting operation in its official histories. The 14-month campaign would be reduced to paragraphs, described as operations in the western direction, without specific detail. Awards and medals for Rzhev veterans would be distributed, but citations would be vague, for courage in battle, rather than for the liberation of Rzhev. Veterans would be encouraged to describe their service in terms of the larger war, rather than specific battles. This wasn't heavy-handed censorship. It was bureaucratic memory management. Zhukov's role in the suppression was crucial. As Deputy Supreme Commander and the Soviet Union's most celebrated general, his reputation required protection. Rzhev had been Zhukov's obsession, and Rzhev had consumed over 1 million Soviet soldiers for minimal strategic gain. If this became public knowledge, it would taint his legacy. The solution was to emphasize Zhukov's successes, Moscow, Stalingrad, eventually Berlin, while minimizing Rzhev. In Zhukov's post-war memoirs, published in the 1960s, the entire Rzhev campaign received 3 pages out of a 700-page book. He described the operations as difficult and noted that they tied down significant German forces, but provided no casualty figures and no detailed operational analysis. The territories liberated around Rzhev required massive reconstruction efforts that Soviet authorities were unprepared to provide. The region had been economically productive before the war. Agriculture, some light industry, functioning communities. Post-liberation, it was an economic dead zone. Fields were mined and uncultivatable. Villages didn't exist. The population was gone. Soviet planners made half-hearted efforts at reconstruction, but priorities lay elsewhere. The war was ongoing, resources were needed for active fronts, and the Rzhev region was too destroyed to fix quickly. Many villages were never rebuilt. The people who had lived there were resettled elsewhere, or simply absorbed into the larger displaced population of wartime Soviet Union. The soldiers who had fought at Rzhev and survived found themselves in an awkward position. They had endured some of the most intense combat of the war, had suffered casualties that exceeded any other single Soviet operation, had witnessed catastrophic failures of Soviet military leadership, but they weren't supposed to talk about it. At veteran gatherings after the war, Rzhev survivors formed informal groups, recognizing each other through coded references. Tvardovsky's poem, "I Was Killed Near Rzhev," became their anthem. The line, "In a nameless bog," was code for, "I was at Rzhev too." But public commemoration was discouraged. No monuments were built. No histories were written. The victory parade through ruins had been the only official acknowledgement, and it had been propaganda. By late 1943, less than a year after the liberation, Rzhev had largely disappeared from Soviet public consciousness. The war had moved west. Kursk, the liberation of Ukraine, the push toward Germany, these became the narrative focus. Rzhev was an embarrassing early operation, too costly to celebrate, too important to the men who fought there to completely erase. It existed in a strange liminal space, not forgotten by those who experienced it, but absent from official memory. Soviet citizens who hadn't been at Rzhev often didn't know the battle had happened. Those who had been there learned not to speak of it. The liberation that wasn't had become the battle that never was. A ghost in the national history, suppressed so thoroughly that 3 generations would pass before the truth began to emerge. And when it did emerge, the survivors would be old men, bitter that their sacrifice had been denied, that their comrades had died in obscurity, that the meat grinder at Rzhev had consumed them and then consumed their memory. April 14, 1943. OKH headquarters, Rastenburg, East Prussia. Field Marshal Walter Model stood before a map board presenting defensive doctrine to Wehrmacht senior commanders. Model had been summoned to explain how 9th Army had held the Rzhev salient for 14 months against overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority, then successfully withdrawn with minimal casualties. His presentation was technical, detailed, and would fundamentally reshape German defensive warfare for the remainder of the war. Model described his system: defense in depth, elastic response, mobile reserves, fortified strongpoints, pre-planned counterattacks. The officers taking notes represented every major command on the Eastern Front. Within months, Model's Rzhev innovations would become standard Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. He had turned tactical necessity into operational art, and in doing so, had taught Germany how to lose the war slowly. The core of Model's defensive system was deceptively simple. Space equals time, and time equals survival. Instead of defending a single trench line rigidly, where breakthrough meant collapse, Model created defensive depth of 25 to 30 kilometers with 3 distinct belts. The forward security zone absorbed the initial attack and identified its direction and strength. The main defensive zone, containing the primary fortifications, was positioned far enough back that Soviet artillery preparation, which typically preceded attacks, fell on the security zone, not the main defenses. The rear defensive zone provided positions for reorganization and counterattack assembly. An attacker had to break through 3 times, and each breakthrough brought them into pre-registered artillery kill zones. Model's innovation extended beyond physical layout to operational tempo. Traditional defense was reactive: wait for attack, defend position, retreat if overwhelmed. Model's defense was proactive. German forces in the security zone weren't expected to hold. They were expected to fight delaying actions while falling back to the main defensive belt, inflicting casualties and buying time. This flexibility prevented Soviet forces from achieving the quick breakthroughs that could be exploited. By the time Soviet units penetrated the security zone, their assault momentum was spent, their formations were disorganized, and they faced fresh German defenders in prepared positions. The mobile reserve concept was perhaps Model's most significant contribution. Wehrmacht doctrine before Rzhev positioned reserves 10 to 20 kilometers behind the front, requiring hours to commit them to threatened sectors. Model positioned reserves 5 to 10 kilometers back, close enough to counterattack within 2 to 3 hours of a Soviet breakthrough. This rapid response prevented Soviet forces from consolidating gains. A typical sequence: Soviet attack penetrates German security zone at 0600 hours. By 0800, Model's staff has identified the breakthrough and ordered reserve divisions forward. By 1000 hours, German counterattacks hit the Soviet flanks, while they're still organizing to continue their advance. Soviet commanders found that every success was immediately contested, preventing exploitation. The Rzhev experience provided empirical validation for Model's theories. Over 14 months, Soviet forces launched 8 major offensive operations and dozens of smaller attacks. None achieved operational breakthrough. Several achieved tactical penetration of 5 to 15 kilometers, enough to seem successful initially, but all were eventually contained and reversed. The casualty ratios proved the system's efficiency. German forces suffered approximately 330,000 casualties, while inflicting well over 1 million Soviet casualties. The 3-to-1 ratio, or higher, depending on which Soviet casualty estimates you accept, demonstrated that defensive warfare, properly executed, could offset numerical inferiority. Wehrmacht adoption of Model's system occurred rapidly. After Rzhev, every major defensive operation on the Eastern Front employed variations of his doctrine. At Kursk in July 1943, Soviet forces defending against German offensive operations used defense in depth with multiple defensive belts, a mirror image of Model's system. German forces defending later at Kursk faced the same tactics they had pioneered. The defensive battles in Ukraine through late 1943 and early 1944 consistently showed German forces trading space for Soviet casualties, withdrawing to successive defensive lines, executing fighting retreats that preserved combat power while bleeding the Red Army. But Model's system contained a fatal strategic flaw. It was perfect for prolonging defeat, useless for achieving victory. Defense in depth assumes you have depth to trade, space you can surrender while preserving forces. But Germany was a finite country surrounded by enemies. Every kilometer traded was a kilometer closer to Berlin. The eastern territories occupied in 1941, Ukraine, Belarusia, the Baltics, had been justified as Lebensraum, living space for German colonization. Model's doctrine meant systematically surrendering this space. The Romanian oil fields, the Ukrainian grain, the occupied territories' industrial capacity, all would be traded for time. and time was working against Germany. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was complex. Model's system gave German soldiers a framework for surviving combat against overwhelming odds. It worked. Units employing his tactics suffered fewer casualties and achieved better results than those fighting rigidly. This restored confidence in German military leadership at the tactical level. Soldiers trusted that if they followed the doctrine, they'd survive. But strategically, Model's success at Rzhev taught the Wehrmacht that defensive excellence was achievable, which reduced pressure to seek negotiated peace or strategic alternatives. If you can defend successfully, there's always the fantasy that something will change. New weapons, Allied discord, Soviet exhaustion. Model's fireproof house gave Germany false hope. The material costs of Model's system were substantial. Defense in depth required extensive fortification. Building 3 defensive belts meant 3 times the construction effort. It required significant artillery allocation to cover all the pre-registered fire zones. It required good communications to coordinate the mobile reserves. It required trained troops who could execute complex tactical withdrawals without panicking. As the war progressed and German forces became increasingly composed of undertrained replacements, elderly reservists, and foreign volunteers, executing Model's doctrine became harder. The system's effectiveness degraded as the quality of troops available to implement it declined. Soviet military theorists studied Model's tactics extensively. Captured German documents describing the Rzhev defensive system were analyzed by Soviet staff colleges. The Red Army began implementing similar concepts, not because they admired German tactics, but because the tactics worked. Soviet defensive operations in 1943 and 44 increasingly featured defense in depth, mobile reserves, and counterattack doctrine. The massive Soviet offensives that eventually broke German lines, Operation Bagration in Belarus, the Vistula-Oder offensive in Poland, succeeded partly because Soviet forces had learned from their Rzhev failures. They developed operational methods specifically designed to penetrate model-style defenses, deeper penetrations on narrower fronts, faster exploitation, better combined arms coordination. Model himself became a specialist in defensive warfare and desperate situations. After Rzhev, he was assigned to command sectors where Soviet breakthroughs seemed imminent. Army Group North Ukraine, Army Group B in France after D-Day, the final defense of the Ruhr, Model was sent wherever defensive genius was needed. He succeeded tactically in most of these assignments, delaying Soviet and Allied advances, preserving forces, conducting successful withdrawals. But each success was temporary, buying weeks or months before the next crisis. Model committed suicide in April 1945 rather than surrender, the ultimate acknowledgement that defensive genius couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. The legacy of Rzhev's defensive operations extended beyond World War II. Military theorists studying the battle identified Model's techniques as perhaps the most effective defensive doctrine employed by any army in the war. Cold War era, NATO defense planning incorporated elements of Model's system: trading space for time, defense in depth, mobile reserves, pre-planned counterattacks. The idea that a numerically inferior defensive force could defeat superior attacking forces through proper tactics became orthodoxy. But the lesson missed at Rzhev was also the most important. Tactical excellence divorced from achievable strategic objectives is ultimately futile. Model built a fireproof house, but the foundation was on sand and the tide was rising. The Wehrmacht learned how to defend brilliantly while losing catastrophically, and that knowledge, extracted from the corpse-strewn forests around Rzhev, couldn't save them. November 7th, 1967. Moscow. Victory Day Parade. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, now 71 years old and in semi-retirement, stood on the reviewing stand watching tanks roll through Red Square. Journalists surrounded him, asking about his greatest victories. Zhukov spoke of Moscow in 1941, of Stalingrad in 1942, of the drive to Berlin in 1945. He spoke for 30 minutes. He never mentioned Rzhev, not once. A reporter, younger, perhaps unaware of protocol, asked directly, "Marshal, what about the Rzhev operations?" Zhukov's face hardened. Rzhev was a supporting operation, he said. It tied down German forces while we prepared for more decisive battles elsewhere. The reporter started to follow up. Zhukov's aide intervened, ending the interview. Later that day, Zhukov dictated notes for his memoirs. The section on Rzhev would be 3 pages. The section on Stalingrad would be 50. Zhukov's post-war career was built on a carefully constructed narrative of military genius. He had saved Moscow. He had planned the Stalingrad encirclement. He had commanded the final assault on Berlin. These accomplishments were real. Zhukov was legitimately one of the most successful Soviet commanders of the war. But his record contained a massive black hole, Rzhev. From January 1942 through March 1943, Zhukov had commanded or planned 8 major offensives against the Rzhev Salient. All failed. Collectively, they consumed over 1 million Soviet soldiers for negligible strategic gain. This failure couldn't coexist with Zhukov's image as the USSR's greatest general, so it was erased. The erasure began during the war itself. After Operation Mars collapsed in December 1942 with catastrophic casualties, Zhukov met privately with Stalin. No minutes of this meeting were recorded, but the outcomes were clear. Mars would be reframed as a diversionary operation designed to draw German attention from Stalingrad. The 1.9 million Soviet troops committed to Mars, more than were committed to the Stalingrad encirclement, would be explained as necessary for the diversion's credibility. The 100,000 dead would be described as acceptable losses for a supporting operation. This narrative required no evidence, just assertion, and it required silence from anyone who knew otherwise. The documentary evidence contradicted the diversion narrative from the start. Stavka planning documents from October and November 1942, declassified in the 1990s, showed Mars and Uranus, the Stalingrad operation, being planned simultaneously but independently. Mars was allocated more troops, more tanks, more artillery than Uranus. The operational objectives for Mars were explicitly stated: encircle and destroy German Army Group Center in the Rzhev, Sihevka, Vyazma area. Nothing in the planning documents describe Mars as diversionary. The timeline confirmed this. Mars and Uranus were both scheduled for late November, suggesting they were conceived as simultaneous major offensives, not as primary operation and diversion. American historian David Glantz's research in newly opened Soviet archives during the 1990s revealed the full scope of the cover-up. Glantz found operational orders, casualty reports, and after-action analyses that made clear Mars had been intended as the primary Soviet offensive of late 1942. Zhukov had personally promised Stalin that Mars would liquidate the Rzhev salient and destroy the German Ninth Army. When Mars failed and Uranus succeeded, the historical narrative inverted the relationship. Stalingrad became the planned centerpiece. Mars became the diversion. Soviet military historians writing in the 1950s through 80s repeated this narrative without access to contradicting documents. The lie became official history. Zhukov's memoirs, published in multiple editions between 1969 and 1974, devoted minimal space to Rzhev. The first edition mentioned the operations in a few paragraphs, describing them as difficult fighting that tied down significant enemy forces. Later editions expanded slightly but maintained the diversion narrative. Zhukov never acknowledged commanding Operation Mars. He never discussed the casualty figures. He never mentioned the encirclement and destruction of 1st Mechanized Corps at Belyi, the failure at Sykevka, the collapse of breakthrough attempts across the entire front. The most catastrophic defeat of his career was reduced to a footnote, explained away, and minimized. The suppression extended to unit histories and veterans' accounts. Soviet divisions that fought at Rzhev had their operational histories edited. The 20th Army, which participated in multiple failed offensives at Rzhev, had its official history describe offensive operations in the western direction, without specifying locations or outcomes. Veterans submitting memoirs for publication found their Rzhev experiences edited out or minimized. Publishers and editors, following guidance from the Defense Ministry, ensured that personal accounts aligned with official history. This wasn't crude censorship with obvious gaps. It was sophisticated narrative management that redirected attention rather than obviously suppressing information. Political factors reinforced the suppression. Zhukov's relationship with Stalin had been complex. Stalin trusted Zhukov's military competence but feared his popularity and potential political threat. After Stalin's death in 1953, Zhukov briefly held political power as defense minister under Khrushchev, but was dismissed in 1957 for alleged Bonapartist tendencies. During his political eclipse, admitting failure at Rzhev would have given his enemies ammunition. Even after partial rehabilitation in the 1960s, Zhukov needed his military reputation intact. The Soviet system venerated great patriotic war heroes. Tarnishing that legacy was unacceptable. The cost of this suppression was paid by the men who had fought at Rzhev. They knew what had happened. They had watched friends die in futile attacks. They had experienced the incompetence, the repeated failures, the casual waste of lives. But they couldn't speak publicly without contradicting official history, which could bring consequences ranging from social ostracism to prosecution for spreading anti-Soviet slander. Rzhev veterans formed informal networks, meeting privately, sharing memories among themselves. They developed coded language, referring to the difficult winter of '42 or operations west of Moscow when they meant Rzhev. They knew the truth would remain buried as long as Zhukov lived, and the Soviet system controlled historical narrative. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union began opening archives. Researchers like Glantz, Svetlana Gerasimova, and others gained access to documents that had been classified for 50 years. The casualty figures emerged, 1.3 to 2 million Soviet losses at Rzhev, depending on how operations were counted. The operational planning for Mars showed its intended primacy. The after-action reports documented the failures honestly, before they were edited for official histories. Slowly, the truth about Rzhev reconstructed itself from fragments Soviet authorities had tried to destroy. Zhukov died in 1974, never having publicly acknowledged the full scope of the Rzhev disaster. His funeral was a state affair. Flags at half-mast, military honors, burial at the Kremlin wall. Eulogies praised his genius, his victories, his service to the Soviet Union. Rzhev wasn't mentioned. The veterans who attended his funeral had complicated feelings. Zhukov had been genuinely brilliant at times. Moscow, Stalingrad, Berlin. But he had also sent hundreds of thousands to their deaths at Rzhev in offensives that couldn't succeed, then spent decades denying those men the recognition they deserved. Was he a hero who made mistakes, or a competent general whose reputation was built on suppressed failures? The answer depended on whether you counted only his successes or included his catastrophes. Contemporary Russian historians face political pressure even now when discussing Rzhev and Zhukov. Putin-era Russia emphasizes great patriotic war mythology as a source of national pride. Zhukov is central to that mythology. His statue stands in prominent Moscow locations. His name adorns streets and schools. Admitting that Zhukov commanded one of the most wasteful campaigns in Soviet military history complicates the heroic narrative. Some Russian historians have faced professional consequences for focusing too critically on Rzhev. The battle remains politically sensitive because it reveals uncomfortable truths about Soviet military leadership and the human cost of victory. The question of redemption versus cover-up remains unresolved. Did Zhukov genuinely believe Mars was a diversion, reinterpreting his own intentions through the lens of later events? Or did he consciously construct a false narrative to protect his reputation? The evidence suggests conscious construction. The planning documents were too explicit, the resource allocation too clear. Zhukov knew Mars had been intended as a major offensive. He chose to describe it otherwise. This makes the suppression not just institutional, but personal. Zhukov's legacy is thus bifurcated: brilliant strategist and architect of victory, but also commander responsible for catastrophic failure who spent 3 decades lying about it. Both are true. History, when it finally tells the full story, doesn't allow choosing just one narrative, and the men who died at Rzhev, whose sacrifice was denied for so long, deserve the complicated truth rather than the comfortable lie. June 26, 1967. A communal apartment in Kalinin, Russia. 8 men in their late 40s and early 50s sat around a kitchen table. No uniforms, no medals displayed, nothing to indicate they were veterans. They met like this every year on June 26th, the anniversary of Operation Seydlitz, when 39th Army had been encircled and destroyed near Belia in 1942. 5 of the 8 had been in 39th Army. 3 had fought in other Rzhev operations. They drank vodka, shared memories, named friends who hadn't survived. They spoke carefully, aware that even private gatherings could be monitored. They never used the word failure. They described events factually. We attacked. Many were killed. The attack failed. This was how Rzhev veterans kept the memory alive, in whispered stories, in private gatherings, in the knowledge that official history had erased them, but they would not erase each other. The psychological burden of fighting at Rzhev was compounded by the suppression of its memory. Soldiers who survive catastrophic battles typically find meaning through public acknowledgement, monuments, parades, honors, the understanding that their sacrifice mattered. Rzhev veterans received none of this. They had endured some of the most intense combat of the Eastern Front, had suffered casualties that exceeded Stalingrad, had witnessed tactical failures that killed hundreds of thousands, and then were told it was a minor operation, barely worth mentioning. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. Your experience says this was monumentally important and traumatic. Official history says it barely happened. The informal networks among Rzhev survivors developed sophisticated communication methods. They couldn't openly identify themselves without risking accusations of contradicting official history or forming unauthorized organizations. Instead, they used cultural markers. Alexander Tvardovsky's poem, I Was Killed Near Rzhev, published in 1946, became their recognition code. The poem's narrator is a dead Soviet soldier speaking from beneath the earth, asking whether Soviet forces eventually won. Answer me, did we take the right course? Was it truly necessary to die? Veterans would quote these lines in conversations. If the other person responded with the next lines, you knew they'd been at Rzhev too. It was a linguistic handshake, a way to identify each other safely. The veterans' gatherings were not officially sanctioned, but were tolerated as long as they remained private and small. The KGB monitored veteran organizations generally, watching for anti-Soviet sentiment or unauthorized political activity. Rzhev, veterans learned to frame their gatherings as personal rather than political. Friends meeting, not former soldiers organizing. They avoided specific criticism of commanders or policy. They shared factual memories. I was in the attack on November 27th. My company started with 120 men. 17 survived. The facts spoke for themselves. No editorial commentary was needed. Some veterans kept detailed personal records. Ivan Vasilyev, who fought in 4 separate Rzhev offensives with the 340th Rifle Division, maintained a handwritten diary from 1946 until his death in 1993. He recorded everything he could remember: dates of attacks, names of fallen comrades, casualty estimates, tactical details. He hid the manuscript in his attic, telling only his children where it was. After his death, the family donated it to the Rzhev Memorial Museum. The diary provided corroborating detail for historians reconstructing the battle. One man's memory, preserving truth that official sources had obscured. The absence of public monuments particularly galled survivors. They would travel to Stalingrad, to Kursk, to other battle sites and see massive memorial complexes, eternal flames, walls inscribed with names, museums, parks. Rzhev had nothing. The city rebuilt after the war, but erected no significant memorial to the battle that had destroyed it. Local authorities, following guidance from Moscow, treated Rzhev as a minor episode. The veterans lobbied quietly for recognition. They submitted petitions. They wrote letters to officials. The responses were bureaucratic deflection. Resources weren't available. Other priorities existed, perhaps in the future. The message was clear. Rzhev would not be commemorated. Families searching for missing soldiers faced particular frustration. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were listed as missing in action at Rzhev. Standard Soviet practice was to provide no information about missing soldiers beyond the fact they were missing, no details about where, when, or under what circumstances. Families submitted requests to the Red Army Personnel Department asking for information. The responses were formulaic. Information about your husband, son, father is not available. He is listed as missing in action. Further information cannot be provided. This left families in permanent limbo, unable to mourn properly because death wasn't confirmed, unable to hope realistically because the circumstances made survival unlikely. The search for remains began informally in the 1960s and 70s. Locals in the Rzhev area, walking through forests, would occasionally find bones, equipment, identification documents. Some would report these to authorities. Some would bury remains themselves. A few dedicated individuals began systematic searches, using metal detectors to locate battlefield debris, following up when they found human remains. This was semi-legal at best. Disturbing war graves without permission was technically forbidden, but authorities generally tolerated small-scale individual efforts as long as they didn't become politically problematic. The glasnost period under Gorbachev in the late 1980s changed the dynamic. Censorship loosened. Veterans felt safer speaking openly. Organizations like Memorial, founded in 1989, began documenting Soviet historical crimes and including military disasters in their work. Rzhev, veterans started publishing memoirs with less editing. Newspapers ran articles about the battle's casualties. The official narrative began cracking. For the first time since the war, veterans could say publicly, "We fought at Rzhev. Over 1 million of us died there. The operation failed. We deserve recognition." The system that had suppressed this truth for 45 years was losing its power to enforce silence. The first significant Rzhev memorial opened in 1995, 52 years after the battle. It was modest, a stone monument with an eternal flame located near the city center. The dedication ceremony brought together aging veterans, many meeting for the first time outside their informal networks. They wept. Not just for the fallen, but for the decades of denial, for having to fight twice, once against the Germans, once against their own government's amnesia. The memorial's inscription read simply, "To the soldiers who fell in battles for Rzhev, 1942 to 1943. No casualty figure, no operational details." But it was acknowledgement. The emotional toll of suppression showed in veteran health records. Studies of Soviet war veterans found that those who fought in battles that received official recognition and commemoration had better long-term psychological outcomes than those from suppressed operations. Rzhev veterans showed higher rates of depression, alcoholism, and social isolation. The lack of public acknowledgement denied them the catharsis that comes from collective mourning and recognition. Their trauma was invalidated. If the battle barely happened according to official history, then your suffering wasn't real either. This gaslighting continued for decades. By the 2000s, most Rzhev veterans were dead. Of the approximately 200,000 who survived the campaign, out of the roughly 1.9 million who fought there, perhaps 10 to 15,000 remained alive by 2000. They were in their 80s and 90s. They had waited a lifetime for recognition. Some received it. The growing acknowledgement of Rzhev in Russian historical consciousness, the memorials, the museums. Others died before the truth fully emerged. Their children and grandchildren carried forward the memory, attending commemoration events, contributing to search battalions that continued recovering remains. The soldiers who wouldn't forget had accomplished something remarkable. They had preserved historical truth through decades of active suppression by one of the most effective censorship systems in history. They had kept the memory of Rzhev alive through whispered stories, private gatherings, coded poetry, hidden diaries. They had refused to accept the official narrative that their suffering was minimal and their sacrifice was negligible, and eventually, their persistence paid off. The truth about Rzhev emerged not because the government decided to reveal it, but because the veterans kept it alive long enough for archives to open and historians to reconstruct it. They had won a second battle against forgetting. And unlike the first battle, this one they won completely. August 3rd, 2012. Rzhev District, Russia. Dr. Elena Karpova, forensic anthropologist, knelt beside a mass grave uncovered by a construction crew. The grave contained approximately 1,500 bodies, all male, all showing signs of violent death. Skeletal analysis indicated death occurred in winter, bone damage patterns consistent with cold weather trauma. Artifacts recovered from the grave included Soviet uniform buttons, ammunition pouches dated 1942, personal items including letters and photographs. One skeleton wore an intact belt buckle engraved with the name Dmitry Sokolov, 3rd Rifle Division. Karpova's team would spend 6 weeks excavating this grave. It was the 47th mass grave discovered in the Rzhev area since systematic archaeological work began in 1990. Each grave told the same story: industrial-scale death, hasty burial, deliberate concealment. The numbers were emerging from the ground, and they couldn't be denied. Modern historical reconstruction of Rzhev's true cost required methodologies beyond traditional archival research. Soviet casualty documents were incomplete, edited, or simply false. But bodies don't lie, neither does demographic data. Forensic archaeology, demographic analysis, comparative statistical methods, and cross-referencing of German and Soviet sources allowed historians to reconstruct casualty figures that Soviet authorities had tried to hide. The work was painstaking and ongoing, but by the early 2000s, scholarly consensus had formed. Rzhev was proportionally the most costly Soviet operation of World War II. Demographic analysis provided the first breakthrough. Soviet census data from 1939 recorded population by district, including age and gender breakdowns. The 1959 census, the first comprehensive post-war census, showed the same districts. Comparing male populations aged 20 to 40 revealed catastrophic losses in military districts that recruited for units assigned to Rzhev. The city of Tver, formerly Kalinin Military District, showed 32% fewer men in this age cohort than would be expected even accounting for normal wartime casualties. This excess loss correlated directly with documented deployment of Tver recruited divisions to Rzhev operations. Extrapolating from these demographic patterns, statisticians estimated that Rzhev operations consumed between 1.3 million and 2.1 million Soviet personnel. The range reflected uncertainty about how to categorize casualties from operations tangentially related to Rzhev. Conservative estimates using only casualties from the 8 major offensives yielded 1.3 million. Broader estimates, including security operations, anti-partisan sweeps, and defensive battles in the Salient, approached 2 million. Even the conservative figure exceeded Stalingrad's total Soviet casualties of approximately 1.1 million. Archaeological evidence corroborated the demographic catastrophe. Since 1990, organized search battalions and amateur archaeologists had recovered over 120,000 individual Soviet soldiers, remains from the Rzhev battlefield. The recovery rate, approximately 10% of the estimated total dead, suggested roughly 1.2 million Soviet dead in the region, consistent with casualty estimates. The spatial distribution of bodies revealed operational patterns. Mass graves near towns that had been fortified villages and models' defensive system. Scattered remains in no man's land between defensive belts. Concentrations of bodies at sites of encirclements like Bloodiest and Sakevka. The condition of recovered remains told stories about how men died. Artillery casualties predominated. Skeletal trauma patterns indicating high explosive fragmentation. Many skeletons showed multiple trauma points, suggesting victims were hit repeatedly or were in proximity to multiple shell bursts. The ratio of complete skeletons to fragmentary remains was abnormally low, indicating bodies were often blown apart by direct hits. Forensic analysis of winter casualties showed evidence of cold trauma, frost damage to bones, indicating soldiers died of exposure after being wounded, unable to reach shelter. German casualty records provided a comparison point that highlighted Soviet losses. Wehrmacht 9th Army casualty reports from the Rzhev period, captured and analyzed post-war, documented approximately 330,000 German casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. Cross-referencing Soviet and German numbers revealed casualty ratios varying by operation. Operation Seidlitz in July 1942 showed roughly 10-to-1 Soviet losses. Operation Mars in November. December 1942 showed 8-to-1. Smaller operations varied from 4-to-1 to 6-to-1. Averaged across the entire campaign, the ratio approached approximately 4 Soviet casualties for every German casualty. This ratio deserves context. Modern military doctrine suggests that attacking forces typically suffer higher casualties than defenders, often at 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratios. But Rzhev's 4-to-1 ratio favoring the defenders occurred across multiple offensives, different seasons, varying force ratios. It wasn't a statistical aberration from a single battle, but a consistent pattern indicating systematic operational dysfunction. Soviet forces were attacking in ways that maximized their own casualties while minimizing German losses. The tactical incompetence was quantifiable. Division destruction rates provided another metric of disaster. Soviet rifle divisions typically entered operations with 8,000 to 10,000 men. After 2 weeks at Rzhev, average division strength dropped to 4,000 to 5,000 effectives, a 50% casualty rate. Soviet military doctrine classified a division as destroyed when it suffered 75% casualties and ceased to function as a coherent unit. By this definition, 47 Soviet rifle divisions were destroyed during the Rzhev campaign, meaning they suffered catastrophic casualties, requiring complete reconstitution. Some divisions were destroyed and reformed multiple times, cycling through 3 or 4 generations of soldiers in 14 months. Tank losses exceeded even infantry casualties proportionally. Soviet armored forces committed approximately 3,300 tanks to Mars alone and lost roughly 1,500 in 3 weeks, a 45% loss rate. Across all Rzhev operations, estimated tank losses approached 3,000 vehicles. German tank losses in the same period, approximately 350. The 9-to-1 tank loss ratio reflected Soviet armored tactics at Rzhev, charging prepared anti-tank positions, operating without adequate infantry support, committing armor piecemeal rather than in concentrated formations. German defenders with 88mm anti-tank guns could destroy Soviet tanks at ranges where Soviet return fire was ineffective. Medical evacuation statistics revealed another dimension of loss. Soviet medical services at Rzhev evacuated approximately 800,000 wounded soldiers from the combat zone. Of these, approximately 35 to 40% died of wounds, infections, or complications before recovery. Roughly 300,000 additional deaths beyond those killed in action. This mortality rate for wounded was significantly higher than in other Soviet operations, reflecting the difficulty of evacuation from the Rzhev battlefield and the inadequate medical infrastructure available. Wounded soldiers often lay in no man's land for hours or days before retrieval, reducing survival rates. Comparative analysis with other Soviet operations highlighted Rzhev's unique awfulness. Stalingrad, August 1942 to February 1943. Approximately 1.1 million Soviet casualties over 6 months, resulting in encirclement and destruction of German 6th Army, a decisive strategic victory justifying the cost. Kursk, July-August 1943. Approximately 860,000 Soviet casualties over 2 months, resulting in permanent German loss of offensive capability on the Eastern Front, another strategic success. Rzhev, January 1942 to March 1943. Approximately 1.3 million to 2 million Soviet casualties over 14 months, resulting in German voluntary withdrawal and minimal strategic gain, an operational failure despite eventual occupation of the territory. The cost per kilometer of territory gained provided another damning metric. Soviet forces at Rzhev advanced a net total of approximately 130 kilometers after 14 months, the distance from the original front line to the final German defensive position after Buffel. This yielded a cost of roughly 10,000 to 15,000 Soviet casualties per kilometer of advance. For comparison, the Vistula-Oder offensive in January-February 1945, a highly successful Soviet operation, cost approximately 1,600 casualties per kilometer advanced. Rzhev was 8 to 10 times more costly per unit of territorial gain than effective Soviet operations later in the war. These numbers, emerging piecemeal from archives and excavations and demographic analyses over 3 decades, constructed an irrefutable case. Rzhev had been a catastrophe. The suppression had been motivated not just by political considerations, but by the sheer embarrassment of the figures. 1.3 million casualties for no clear strategic gain couldn't be explained or justified, so they were hidden. But forensic history, combining multiple methodological approaches, reconstructed them anyway. The numbers don't lie. They can be obscured, classified, edited, minimized. But eventually, with enough effort, they emerge. And at Rzhev, they told a story of waste, of tactical incompetence, of soldiers sent to die in operations that couldn't succeed. The bones in the mass graves were proof that couldn't be suppressed forever. March 4th, 1943. The Kremlin, Stalin's private office. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky presented the final operational summary of the Rzhev campaign to the State Defense Committee. The numbers were stark. 1.3 million Soviet casualties, minimal territorial gains. German forces successfully withdrawn with combat effectiveness intact. Vasilevsky concluded with a strategic assessment. The Rzhev operations fixed significant German forces in place, preventing their redeployment to more critical sectors. This allowed successful operations at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus. Stalin interrupted. How many German divisions were fixed at Rzhev? Vasilevsky consulted his notes. 22 divisions, approximately 330,000 men. Stalin performed the calculation aloud. 1.3 million Soviet casualties to fix 330,000 Germans. 4 of ours for 1 of theirs. And we call this success? Vasilevsky had no response. Stalin dismissed him. The strategic verdict on Rzhev had been delivered by its architect. From a purely strategic perspective, evaluating Rzhev requires separating what was intended from what was achieved. Soviet operational planning, from January 1942 through November 1942, consistently aimed to encircle and destroy German Army Group Center, eliminating the German force closest to Moscow and potentially creating a breakthrough that could end the war. This objective was never achieved, not even partially. At no point did Soviet forces at Rzhev threaten the integrity of Army Group Center or force German withdrawal through operational defeat. The Germans withdrew in March 1943, not because they were beaten, but because they chose to shorten their defensive line. The post hoc justification that Rzhev was a fixing operation designed to tie down German forces cannot be supported by the planning documents. Fixing operations are characterized by economy of force. Use minimal resources to prevent enemy redeployment. Rzhev was characterized by massive resource commitment. 1.9 million men in Operation Mars alone, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, sustained operations over 14 months. This isn't fixing. This is attempting destruction and failing. The fixing narrative was constructed after the fact to rationalize failure as intentional strategy. However, unintentional strategic effects did occur. 22 German divisions spent 14 months at Rzhev that could theoretically have been deployed elsewhere. During the critical period from November 1942 to February 1943, when German forces at Stalingrad were encircled and needed relief, those 22 divisions at Rzhev were unavailable. During the Caucasus offensive in summer and fall 1942, when German forces were attempting to capture Soviet oil fields, Rzhev divisions couldn't be redeployed. The question becomes, was this strategic benefit worth the cost? The counterfactual analysis is instructive. Suppose those 22 German divisions had been available for redeployment in late 1942. Could they have relieved 6th Army at Stalingrad? Possibly. The German relief operation, Operation Winter Storm, came within 50 kilometers of Stalingrad before being halted by Soviet forces. An additional 4 to 6 divisions might have made the difference. Could they have secured the Caucasus oil fields? Less likely. The Caucasus campaign failed primarily due to overstretched logistics and Soviet defensive adaptations, not lack of combat power. The most probable scenario: redeploying Rzhev divisions would have extended German operational capability by weeks or months, but wouldn't have fundamentally changed the war's outcome. From this perspective, Rzhev achieved a minimal strategic positive. It consumed German resources and prevented their use elsewhere. But the efficiency was catastrophic. The Soviets traded 4 soldiers for 1 German soldier. In attritional terms, this only makes sense if you have quadruple the population and can sustain quadruple the casualty rate indefinitely. The Soviet Union could sustain higher casualties than Germany, but not at 4-to-1 ratios. The demographic and economic damage of Rzhev strained Soviet society severely. Labor shortages, agricultural production declines, psychological trauma, all were exacerbated by the industrial-scale death at Rzhev. The alternative strategy, not attacking at Rzhev, deserves consideration. Soviet forces could have fixed German divisions at Rzhev through minimal defensive operations, threatening counterattacks, but not executing costly offensives. This would have prevented German withdrawal while preserving Soviet combat power for use elsewhere. The troops wasted at Rzhev could have reinforced Stalingrad earlier, accelerated the liberation of Ukraine, or built strategic reserves. The tanks destroyed at Rzhev could have equipped additional mechanized corps for decisive operations. The opportunity cost of Rzhev was enormous. Defenders of the Rzhev campaign argue it was a necessary learning experience. Soviet forces began the battle using crude tactics, mass frontal assaults, poor coordination, predictable operational patterns. By the end, they had developed more sophisticated methods, better reconnaissance, improved combined arms operations, more realistic casualty assessments. This learning curve was paid for in blood, but the lessons enabled later success. Without the failures at Rzhev, perhaps the victories at Kursk and beyond wouldn't have been possible. This argument has merit, but raises ethical questions about using human beings as experimental subjects in tactical development. The German perspective provides additional context. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, later wrote that holding the Rzhev salient was a strategic mistake that tied down forces desperately needed elsewhere. Model's defensive success was tactically impressive but strategically counterproductive. It encouraged Hitler to believe that outnumbered German forces could hold over extended positions indefinitely. The success at Rzhev contributed to the disaster at Stalingrad by creating false confidence in German defensive capabilities. Both sides made strategic errors at Rzhev, but Soviet errors cost far more lives. Economic analysis reveals another dimension of waste. Soviet industrial production in 1942 and 1943 focused on replacing losses from ongoing operations. The 3,000 tanks lost at Rzhev required replacement. The thousands of artillery pieces destroyed required replacement. The aircraft shot down required replacement. Soviet industry was capable but finite. Every tank built to replace one destroyed at Rzhev was a tank not available for other operations. The industrial opportunity cost compounded the human cost. The political strategic dimension cannot be ignored. Stalin needed to demonstrate Soviet offensive capability for multiple audiences, to reassure the Soviet population that victory was achievable, to convince Western allies that the USSR was a capable partner worth supporting, to intimidate Germany into believing Soviet defeat was impossible. Continuous offensive operations, even failed ones, served these political objectives. Rzhev was theater as much as military operation. The casualties were real, but the purpose was partly performative. Whether this justifies the cost is a matter of political philosophy more than military analysis. The ultimate strategic verdict on Rzhev is paradoxical. It was simultaneously a failure and a success. As a military operation intended to destroy Army Group Center, it failed completely. As an attritional fixing operation, it succeeded at catastrophic cost. As a learning experience, it provided brutal lessons in operational warfare. As political theater, it demonstrated Soviet willingness to sustain casualties indefinitely. The question, what was it for, has no single answer because Rzhev served multiple purposes, some intended, some accidental, some constructed retroactively. What can be stated definitively, Rzhev represented Soviet military strategy at its most brutal and least efficient. The willingness to trade 4 lives for 1 was quintessentially Stalinist. Human beings were resources to be expended for state objectives. The tactical incompetence that characterized Rzhev operations was systemic, reflecting poor training, rigid doctrine, and commanders who feared reporting failure more than they feared wasting lives. The suppression of Rzhev's history reflected institutional unwillingness to confront these realities. The strategic lesson of Rzhev, that tactical excellence matters, that casualties must be justified by achievable objectives, that soldiers are not infinite resources, was learned but never acknowledged. The meat grinder at Rzhev ground up men and ground up truth. The strategic verdict is written in mass graves and demographic voids. It should never have happened this way. June 22, 2020. Withdrawal, Russia. President Vladimir Putin stood before a towering bronze statue, a Soviet soldier, 25 meters tall, striding forward with rifle, emerging from a wall of stylized bayonets and faces. Behind him, the names of 17,000 identified soldiers who died at Rzhev were etched on granite panels. Putin spoke to an audience of veterans, officials, and international dignitaries. The courage of those who fought here, their sacrifice for the motherland, must never be forgotten. They held the line, they bled the enemy. They made victory possible. The speech emphasized heroism, sacrifice, national defense. What it didn't mention, the casualty figures, the failed offensives, the suppression of memory for 77 years. The memorial's dedication represented both acknowledgement and continued manipulation. Rzhev was finally being commemorated, but the story being told remained carefully controlled. The contemporary struggle over Rzhev's memory reflects deeper tensions in Russian national identity. The Great Patriotic War is sacred in Russian culture. The defining triumph, the moment of national consolidation, the proof of Russian strength and resilience. Victory Day is Russia's most important holiday. War memorials are sites of pilgrimage. Veterans are venerated. Into this mythologized landscape, Rzhev introduces uncomfortable complexity, massive casualties for minimal gain, tactical incompetence, suppression of truth, suffering that was denied and forgotten. Acknowledging Rzhev means complicating the triumphalist narrative. Russian society, and particularly the Russian state, have struggled with this complication. The memorial itself became a political controversy before construction began. Original designs included walls listing casualty figures, 1.3 million Soviet losses versus 330,000 German losses. Defense Ministry officials objected, arguing that emphasizing casualty ratios dishonored the sacrifice and played into anti-Soviet narratives. The figures were removed from the final design. What remained was commemoration without context, names of dead soldiers without explaining why they died or what their deaths achieved. This selective memory continued the suppression in new form. Educational treatment of Rzhev shows similar tensions. Modern Russian history textbooks, revised extensively during the Putin era to emphasize patriotic narrative, include Rzhev as a defensive operation that tied down significant German forces and prevented their use at Stalingrad. The casualty figures, when mentioned, are minimized, heavy losses rather than specific numbers. The operational failures are explained as difficult conditions and fierce enemy resistance rather than tactical incompetence. Students learn that Rzhev was part of the victorious war effort, but not that it was proportionally the most costly operation of that effort. Public awareness of Rzhev has increased significantly since the Soviet collapse. Surveys conducted in 1999 showed 34% of Russians could identify the Battle of Rzhev. By 2022, that figure had risen to 61%. The increase reflects several factors: the opening of archives and publication of historical research, the activities of search battalions recovering remains and generating media coverage, the construction of memorials and museums, and government emphasis on war commemoration generally. Younger Russians are more likely to know about Rzhev than their parents' generation, a reversal of the typical pattern where historical knowledge declines over time. The search battalions, volunteer organizations that locate and recover remains of Soviet soldiers, have become crucial to Rzhev's memory. Groups like Dolg, Duty, Pamyat, Memory, and Nabat, Alarm Bell, spend weeks each year in the forests around Rzhev, using metal detectors and excavation techniques to find bodies. They have recovered over 120,000 sets of remains since the 1990s. When identification is possible, through military paybooks, engraved personal items, or forensic analysis, they notify families. Often descendants attend reburial ceremonies, finally learning where grandfather or great-grandfather died 75 years earlier. This grassroots memory work operates independently of official narrative, driven by volunteers who believe the dead deserve identification and proper burial. The Rzhev Memorial Museum, opened in 2021, represents partial official acknowledgement. The museum presents Rzhev comprehensively: battle chronology, tactical details, personal stories, artifacts recovered from the battlefield. The exhibits include casualty figures, though displayed without editorial comment about their implications. Veterans' testimony is featured prominently, including accounts describing failed attacks and catastrophic losses. The museum doesn't shy entirely from uncomfortable facts, but neither does it frame Rzhev as a failure. The narrative presented is, brave Soviet soldiers fought against overwhelming odds, suffered terribly, ultimately prevailed. The prevailed is debatable, but the museum exists, which itself represents progress from total suppression. International dialogue about Rzhev has developed in unexpected ways. German and Russian historians have collaborated on research projects, sharing archives and comparing perspectives. German-Russian memorial ceremonies have occurred at Rzhev, attended by descendants of soldiers from both sides. These events emphasize shared humanity and the tragedy of war rather than national triumph. A 2018 ceremony featured a German participant placing flowers at the Soviet memorial, while a Russian participant reciprocated at a German cemetery. Small gestures, acknowledging that soldiers on both sides were human beings, caught in a catastrophe not entirely of their making. Political exploitation of Rzhev memory continues in more subtle forms. Putin-era Russia has used great patriotic war memory to foster nationalism and justify current policies. References to fighting fascism are deployed against domestic opposition and foreign critics. Rzhev fits awkwardly into this framework. The soldier's sacrifice was real and deserving of honor. But the operational context reveals leadership failures that contradict the narrative of Soviet competence. Russian officials navigate this by emphasizing the sacrifice while minimizing the context, allowing patriotic interpretation without confronting uncomfortable questions. Liberal Russian historians face professional risks when analyzing Rzhev critically. Several have experienced difficulty getting work published in state-supported venues, lost academic positions, or face public attacks for dishonoring veterans. The space for critical historical analysis has contracted under Putin's government. Saying Soviet tactics at Rzhev were incompetent and wasteful is factually supportable, but politically fraught. It can be interpreted as anti-patriotic or as undermining respect for the war generation. Historians must choose between academic integrity and professional security. The generational dimension is crucial. The last Rzhev veterans are dying. The youngest survivors are now in their late 90s. Once they're gone, the battle passes entirely from living memory into history. This transition changes how it can be discussed. Veterans have moral authority to contradict official narratives based on lived experience. Historians have only documents and analysis. The loss of veteran voices makes it easier to reimpose simplified narratives. The race to record veteran testimony before the generation dies is driven partly by understanding that their deaths will enable renewed historical manipulation. Families of Rzhev victims navigate complex emotional terrain. Many feel pride that their relatives fought in the Great Patriotic War, anger that their sacrifice was suppressed for decades, grief that bodies were left unburied and unidentified, satisfaction that acknowledgement is finally occurring, and frustration that acknowledgement is incomplete. A granddaughter of a soldier who died in Operation Mars described her feelings. "I'm glad he's finally recognized, but I'm angry it took 75 years, and I'm angry that even now we can't say honestly what happened, that he died in a failed offensive, that his commanders wasted his life, that this shouldn't have happened." Contemporary memory construction at Rzhev reveals a fundamental tension. Can a society honor sacrifice while acknowledging that sacrifice was wasted? Can you simultaneously say, "These men died heroically," and "These men died unnecessarily"? Russian culture has struggled to hold both truths simultaneously. The tendency is to choose one, either emphasize heroism and ignore waste, or emphasize waste and diminish heroism. The intellectually honest approach holds both. The soldiers fought bravely under horrific conditions, and their commanders sent them to die in operations that couldn't succeed. Both are true. Both deserve acknowledgement. The 20-meter bronze soldier at the Rzhev Memorial strides forward eternally, frozen in bronze, representing the over 1 million men who died there. The memorial's inscription reads, "To the soldiers and officers of the Red Army who fell in the battles for Rzhev and in the Rzhev Vyazma offensive operations of 1942 to 1943. It's acknowledgement. It's incomplete acknowledgement. It's better than the 77 years of suppression that preceded it. The memory wars at Rzhev continue, between those who want full truth and those who want comfortable myth, between the evidence emerging from archives and graves and the narratives that serve political purposes, between the soldiers who wouldn't forget and the institutions that tried to make them forgotten. The final verdict on Rzhev's memory is still being written. The battle is emerging from suppression, but not yet fully into honest reckoning. The bones continue to surface. The archives continue to open. The children and grandchildren continue to search for answers. And the question posed by Tverdovsky's poem remains unanswered. Answer me. Did we take the right course? Was it truly necessary to die? The dead of Rzhev are still waiting for an honest answer. The living owe them one. Whether Russian society and its government will provide that answer or continue the sophisticated suppression that has replaced crude denial remains to be seen. The meat grinder has stopped turning, but the struggle over what it means continues, and that struggle is itself part of Rzhev's legacy. The battle for truth that outlasts the battle for terrain.